There is a story that has been traveling for 2,500 years. It has crossed rivers and mountain ranges in the long silence of forgotten centuries. It has been carried by monks walking barefoot on dusty roads, by pilgrims with nothing but a clay bowl and a saffron robe, by grandmothers whispering to children in the dark, by scholars in lamplight who bent close to palm leaf manuscripts and copied, word by word, what someone else had copied before them. And tonight, after all of that traveling, after all of that careful carrying, it has found its way to you. You do not need to do anything with it. You do not need to remember every detail in the morning, or take notes, or hold the thread of each story tightly in your hands. You only need to be here, in this quiet, breathing slowly, and letting the words move through you the way water moves around stones in a shallow river, without resistance, without effort, without anywhere particular to go. Let your body settle now into whatever surface holds you. Let the weight of the day begin to soften and release. Let the muscles around your eyes go loose. Let your jaw unclench. Let your hands open. There is nothing you need to do tonight except rest and listen. Before this night is over, you will understand why the most powerful thing you can do with a gift is sometimes to simply leave it where it was placed. That is the heart of what we are going to explore together. Not in a hurry, not with urgency, but slowly, a way the stories were always meant to be told. In the dark, in the quiet, when the thinking mind has grown tired and soft, and something deeper in you is finally ready to hear. The stories come from ancient India, from the dusty roads and mango groves and fire-lit courtyards and wide brown rivers of a world that existed more than 2,000 years ago. But the people in these stories are not distant or strange. They were afraid. They were grieving. They were proud and confused and sometimes cruel. They wanted things they could not have, and they held on to things that were already leaving. And sometimes, just sometimes, they let go and found that what waited on the other side of letting go was something they had not expected, something that felt more than anything else like rest. So close your eyes now if you haven't already. Take one slow breath in and let the first story begin. In the 5th year after the Buddha's awakening, in the season when the mango trees were heavy with unripe fruit and the roads were pale with heat, a man named Akkosa set out from the city of Rajagaha with fury in his chest and a speech prepared in his mind. He had rehearsed the speech many times. He had shaped it the way a potter shapes clay, pressing here, smoothing there, finding the exact words that would do the most damage to the man he was going to see. He was good with words. He had spent his whole life being good with words. He was a Brahmin, which meant that language was his inheritance, his trade, the thing his family had passed down through generations the way other families passed down fields or fishing boats. He knew how to use words to elevate, to impress, to argue, to wound. He planned to wound, and he was going to find was known by many names in those days. Some people called him the Tathagata, a Pali word that means something like the one who has gone thus, or the one who has arrived thus, a name that points at something so outside ordinary categories that language has to double back on itself just to gesture at it. Others called him the Awakened One, or the Sage of the Shakyas, or simply the Teacher. His personal name was Kisa Gotami, and before he became all of those other things, he had been a prince of the Shakya clan, born in the foothills of what is now Nepal, into a life of extraordinary privilege. Akkosa did not care about any of that. What Akkosa cared about was his brother. His brother's name was Ahimsaka, the harmless one, and he had recently done something that Akkosa found not just personally painful, but socially unforgivable. Ahimsaka had gone to listen to the wandering teacher. He had sat in the shade of the Jatavana grove with hundreds of other people and listened to the quiet voice of the man who had once been a prince. And something in what he heard had changed him so completely that he had given away his property, set aside his Brahmin robes, taken up a simple bowl and robe of faded saffron, and joined the community of monks who followed the Buddha's path through the world. For Akkosa, this was not a spiritual matter. It was a wound. You have to understand what the world looked like from where Akkosa stood. Lived in a society that was held together, in his view, by the proper ordering of things. Brahmins were at the top of that ordering. They were the keepers of the sacred texts, the performers of the rituals that maintained the right relationship between human beings and the divine. A Brahmin who set aside his robes and went begging in the streets was not making a personal choice. He was, in Akkosa's eyes, unraveling something essential. He was saying publicly that everything their family stood for, everything their father had stood for, their father's father, was worth less than the words of a wandering teacher from a clan that ranked below theirs. It was, in the deepest sense, an insult, and Akkosa had come to return it. The Jetavana monastery was a grove of ancient trees and simple buildings just outside the city of Savatthi in the kingdom of Kosala. A merchant named Anathapindika had purchased it and offered it to the Sangha, the community of monks, some years before, paying what the texts describe as a staggeringly large sum, covering the ground of the entire grove with gold coins laid edge to edge until the owner relented and sold. It was, by the standards of the time, a place of some prestige. Kings visited it. Wealthy families made offerings there, and scholars came from distant provinces to debate the finer points of philosophy with the monks who lived among its trees. Akkosa walked through the gate of the Jetavana without looking at any of this. His eyes were fixed on finding the man he had come to find. He found him in the early morning, sitting beneath a tree at the edge of a clearing. The light through the canopy above was pale gold, a kind of morning light that makes everything look as though it is being seen through still water. Monks were moving quietly along the paths nearby. Birds were calling from somewhere higher up in the trees. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke and the faint sweetness of the sal blossoms that were just beginning to open along the garden's edges. The man sitting beneath the tree was not a large man. He was not doing anything dramatic. He was simply sitting with his hands resting loosely in his lap, in the posture that his students had come to recognize as natural to him. The posture of someone who has found a way to be completely still without being rigid, completely at ease without being slack. His eyes were open but soft, not focused on anything in particular. He looked, more than anything else, like someone who'd had nowhere else to be. Akkosa did not offer a greeting. He did not observe any of the formal courtesies that were customary when approaching a holy man in that time and culture, and those courtesies were elaborate, carefully prescribed, deeply important. He simply stopped in front of the seated figure and began to speak. The words that came out of his mouth were not gentle ones. He called the Buddha a fraud who exploited the confusion of weak-minded people. He called him a thief of good men from good families. He used the full register of Brahmin contempt, a register that had been refined over centuries to be maximally cutting, designed to strip a person of their dignity in front of witnesses, to make them feel small and exposed and unworthy of the air they were breathing. He accused the Buddha of destroying his family. He accused him of false teaching, of false claims to wisdom, of gathering followers through deception rather than genuine insight. He was thorough. He had, after all, prepared carefully, and throughout all of it, the man beneath the tree did not move. He did not stiffen. He did not flush. He did not arrange his face into the expression of controlled anger that people wear when they are about to respond to an attack with one of equal force. He did not look away or look down or do any of the things that people do when they are absorbing a blow and trying not to show how much it landed. He simply listened, the way the grove was listening, the way the morning was listening, without resistance, without flinching, without anywhere particular to go. When Akkosa finally stopped, not because he had run out of things to say, but because the silence of the man in front of him had begun to feel, somehow, like a wall that his words were hitting without leaving any mark, the Buddha looked at him with an expression that was, more than anything else, curious. "Brahmin," he said, "if you prepared a feast for guests who had traveled a long way to your home, And when they arrived, none of them ate the food you had prepared. To whom would that food belong? Akkosa blinked. This was not a response he had prepared for. It would remain mine, he said after a moment. Obviously, if no one receives what is offered, it stays with the one who offered it. Just so, said the Buddha. This morning, you have brought me a great many things. You have brought anger and contempt and accusations and words carefully chosen to cause pain. I do not receive any of these things, Akkosa. I leave them where they are placed. And so, by your own reasoning, to whom do they belong? The grove was very still. You can imagine the quality of that stillness if you let yourself. The morning light unchanged, the birds still calling from somewhere above. None. The monks still moving quietly on the distant paths. And in the center of all that ordinary continuance, a man standing alone with something he had brought a long way to give away, and finding that it had nowhere to go. And Akkosa had built his life on the power of words to move things, to wound things, to change the shape of situations in his favor. He had never before stood in a place where words simply stopped, where they arrived and found nothing to attach to, and fell away from the face of the man in front of him like rainwater falling from polished stone. You speak, he said more slowly now, the anger draining from his voice and leaving something rawer in its place, as though nothing touches you, as though you feel nothing. I feel a great deal, the Buddha said, and his voice was gentle in a way that Akkosa had not expected, not soft in the way of weakness, gentle in the way of something that has no need to prove its own strength. I feel the morning, I feel the light through these trees, I feel, if I am completely honest with you, some concern for you, because you have walked a long way carrying something very heavy, and I can see that you are still holding it.
Concern,
Akkosa repeated, and the word sounded strange in his mouth, coming from this direction. Your brother did not leave your family to wound you, the Buddha said. He left because he found something he needed. That is not a reflection on you, or on your father, or on the tradition that shaped you both. It is simply what happens sometimes when a person encounters an understanding that changes the way they see. The path he is walking will not, in the end, make him less. It will make him more capable of kindness than he has ever been. I am sorry that his choice has brought you pain. This is the moment the texts record with a particular care, not a dramatic conversion, not a sudden flooding of light, just a man who came to a grove with fury in his hands and found that the fury had nowhere to land, and stood for a moment in the unexpected space that opened up when there was nothing left to push against. The Pali phrase that appears in the commentaries for what happened next is Chittam parasudim agamasi. The mind became clear, not convinced, not argued into submission, not overpowered by superior rhetoric. Simply clear the way water becomes clear when you stop stirring it and let it settle on its own. Akkosa placed his palms together. He bowed. A Brahmin who had arrived with a speech full of contempt offered in the end a different kind of gift. The gift of acknowledgement, of a bow of palms pressed together in the ancient gesture that says, roughly, I see the light in you, even though a few minutes ago I came here specifically to extinguish it. And the Buddha received this gift simply, quietly, without triumph. There is a teaching hidden inside this exchange that is easy to miss if you are moving quickly through it. It is not really about anger management, though it looks like that on the surface. It is about something deeper, about the nature of what we think of as receiving. Every day you are offered things. Some of them are pleasant. Kindness, beauty, the small unexpected gestures of people who care about you. And some of them are difficult. Criticism, anger, the accumulated weight of other people's fears arriving in your direction. And the question that the Buddha posed to Akkosa, to whom does it belong if you do not receive it, Nanda, is not only about refusing anger. It is about understanding that you have more choice in what you receive than you have perhaps believed. You are not obligated to take everything that is handed to you. Not every fear that arrives in your direction belongs to you. Not every harsh word needs to be absorbed into the tissue of your self-understanding. Not every judgment from someone who is themselves in pain needs to be accepted as a truth about who you are. The Pali word for this kind of wise non-reception is upekha, a word usually translated as equanimity. Though that translation is a little too distant, a little too cool. Upekha is not the calm of someone who has stopped feeling. It is the calm of someone who feels everything and has simply gradually learned not to be knocked sideways by it. It is the stability that comes from being deeply rooted rather than from being braced. The tree that bends in the wind without falling, not because it is rigid, but because its roots go down far enough that the wind cannot find enough of it to uproot. You are building those roots right now in the quiet of this night without even trying. Rest is one of the ways the roots grow. Stillness is one of the ways the roots grow. The simple act of being here, breathing, letting the stories move through you. This is not nothing. This is the ground being prepared. Akkosa walked back through the gates of the Jetavana that morning a different man than the one who had walked in. He could not have told you exactly what had changed or how. He only knew that the thing he had been carrying, the hot, carefully tended flame of his resentment, had somehow gone out, not because he had abandoned it, but because, in a grove of morning light, he had encountered something so thoroughly unaffected by fire that the fire had simply had nowhere to burn. He went home. He sat for a long time in his courtyard. He thought about his brother, and about the Buddha's words. Your brother did not leave to wound you, and something in those words continued to do their quiet work in him long after the morning was over. And somewhere in the Jetavana, the man who had sat beneath the tree went on sitting. The morning continued around him. The light moved through the canopy in its slow way. The birds went about their various businesses. And the gift that Akkosa had brought, every insult, every accusation, every carefully sharpened word, lay unclaimed on the path between them, belonging to no one, dissolving gradually in the morning air. Before we go forward, there is something you might be wondering. Not about Akkosa, but about the man who sat beneath the tree. You might be wondering, how does a person become capable of that? Where does that kind of stillness come from? None. Was the Buddha simply born different from the rest of us, wired in some way that made him naturally immune to what would crack most people open? The answer is no, and the answer to that no is a story that begins many years before that morning in the Jetavana Grove on the banks of a river in the dark. That story is where we are going next. Let your breath slow a little more as we travel back, and the Jetavana Grove fades behind us. The morning fades. We are going further back now, to the night before everything changed, to the river that remembers what happened there and why it mattered, and what it cost the man who sat beside it until the stars had crossed the whole of the sky. If you had stood on the bank of the Niranjana River on a particular night in the 6th century before the Common Era, you would have seen something that looked on the surface very ordinary. A man sitting beneath a tree, that is all. Nothing dramatic in the visible arrangement of things. No crowd, no ceremony, no fire, no music. Just a man in his middle 30s, thin from years of austere practice, sitting very still on a cushion of grass beside a river that moved past him in the darkness without particular interest in what he was doing. The tree above him was a fig of the species called Ficus religiosa, a wide, generous tree with heart-shaped leaves that caught the faint starlight and turned it into small, moving shadows on the ground. The air smelled of the river and of the earth and of the blossoms of the forest behind him. The man's name was Kisa Gotami, and the ordinary appearance of the scene was entirely misleading, because what was happening inside that stillness was nothing short of the most consequential interior event in the history of the human mind. But to understand why, you need to know who he was before he sat down beside that river. Need to go back further still, to a palace in the foothills of the Himalayan range, to the childhood of a boy who would grow up to refuse a kingdom. The boy was born into the Shakya clan, in a city called Kapilavathu, a prosperous place, a place of wide streets and well-kept gardens, a place where the right family with the right connections could live a life of considerable comfort and almost total insulation from the more difficult textures of the world outside the walls. His father, Suddhodana, was the ruler of the Shakyas, a man who wanted many things for his son, but above all wanted him to stay. A court astrologer had told Suddhodana at the moment of the child's birth that the boy had two possible destinies. He would become either a great king who united the known world or a great spiritual teacher who illuminated it. And Suddhodana, being a king and not a philosopher, strongly preferred the first option. And so the boy grew up inside carefully constructed walls. He grew up with every pleasure that the ancient world could provide. Beautiful gardens, accomplished teachers, music and dance in the company of young people who were themselves carefully selected for their beauty and cheerfulness. He grew up, as Ashvaghosha describes him in the Buddha Karita, the great Sanskrit life of the Buddha, written in the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, as someone surrounded by delight but gradually growing aware that the delight was a kind of enclosure and gift with walls around it. The moment that cracked the enclosure open is one of the most famous in the Buddhist tradition, and you may have encountered it before. It is called in the later commentarial literature the Four Sights. The young prince, now grown, ventures outside the palace walls on a series of chariot rides, and on each ride he encounters something that his sheltered upbringing has kept from him entirely. First, an old man, bent and slow, his body no longer doing what he needed it to do. His face carrying in it the accumulated evidence of decades of living in a body that changes and weakens and cannot be stopped from doing so. Second, a sick man, lying by the road, his body in pain, his face turned to the sky in the particular way of someone whose relationship to their own physical existence has become complicated and frightened. Third, a corpse, and being carried through the city gates on a wooden litter, surrounded by grieving people who were in their grief entirely ordinary, not mythological, not dramatic, just people in the acute agony of loss. And fourth, and this is the sight that tips the balance, a wandering ascetic, a man with a shaved head and a robe of rough cloth, walking alone, carrying nothing, his face carrying something that none of the other faces the prince had seen that day were carrying, something that the text described carefully as peace. The young man who would become the Buddha sat in his chariot and looked at that fourth sight for a long time. He went home that night, to his palace, to his wife, the gentle Yasodhara, who had recently given birth to their son, a child the prince named Rahula, which means fetter or chain, because he understood, even in his joy at his son's birth, that love of this kind was also the beginning of a new and very deep fear, the fear of losing what you love. He went home to his gardens and his music and the life his father had so carefully built for him. And he sat in the dark and thought about the old man, the sick man, the corpse, and the wandering man with the peaceful face. And in the small hours of the night he made a decision. He left. He walked out of the palace quietly, past the sleeping musicians, past the sleeping dancers, past the guards who were themselves somewhere between sleep and waking. And he paused at the door of Yasodhara's chamber and looked in at her sleeping with their infant son beside her. The texts say he almost went in, almost gathered them both in his arms and stayed, and then he turned and walked out into the night. This departure is one of the most debated moments in the entire story of the Buddha's life. Was it cruel? Was it necessary? Was it both? And there are Buddhist scholars and teachers who have written thousands of pages wrestling with this question, and I am not going to settle it for you tonight. What I will say is this: a man who walked out of that palace was not running from love. He was running toward a question that love itself had made unavoidable. Why does everything I love have to be something I can lose? Is there a way through that fear? Is there something on the other side of it that is stable, that does not depend on conditions staying the way they are? He spent the next 6 years trying to find out, and he studied with the great meditation teachers of his day, masters named Alara Kalama and Udaka Ramaputta, who taught him to reach states of mind so refined and still that they felt in the moment like they must surely be the liberation he was looking for. He mastered both systems completely, and each time he reached the peak of what his teacher had to offer, he asked, "Is this it? Is this the end of suffering? Not the final freedom?" And each time he knew with a quiet certainty that he could not talk himself out of that it was not. These states were real, and they were beautiful, and they were also, like everything else, temporary. And he came out of them. Dukkha was still there. The subtle, grinding ache of impermanence was still there, waiting patiently for him to return from whatever elevated state he had temporarily occupied. No. The Pali word dukkha is one of those terms that resists clean translation. It is usually rendered as suffering in English, but that word is too heavy, too dramatic for what dukkha actually describes most of the time. None. Dukkha is the dissatisfaction that lives at the very center of ordinary experience, the sense that things are not quite right, that what we have is never quite enough, that even our happiest moments carry inside them a faint undertone of unease because we know somewhere underneath the happiness that it will not last. It is the texture of a life lived in the constant awareness, conscious or not, that everything changes. So he left the meditation masters. He joined a group of 5 ascetics who believed that the path to liberation ran through the systematic suppression of physical desire, through fasting, through exposure, through a kind of controlled suffering intended to burn away the attachment to the body and its appetites. He followed this path with extraordinary commitment. He ate almost nothing, none. He sat in the heat of the Indian sun without shade. He pushed his body to the very edge of what a body can endure and still be alive. And he found again, with the quiet certainty that he could not argue away, that this was not it either. That a body this depleted could not think clearly enough to find what he was looking for. That suppression is not liberation. That you cannot reach freedom by punishing the thing you are trying to be free from. He accepted a bowl of rice porridge from a young woman named Sujata, who found him sitting beneath a tree by the road. So thin and still, she initially mistook him for a tree spirit. He ate it slowly. He felt his strength begin to return. The 5 ascetics who had been practicing with him saw him eat and were disgusted. They concluded he had given up, backslid, returned to a life of comfort, and they left him. He was alone. He walked to the bank of the Niranjana River. He bathed. He found a spot beneath a wide fig tree on the eastern bank, and he sat down, and he reached down with his right hand and touched the earth beneath him, the ancient gesture, the Humisparsha Mudra, the earth witnessing that you see in almost every statue of the seated Buddha across the entire breadth of Buddhist art. And he made a vow. He would not rise from this place until he had found what he was looking for, or until he had found that it could not be found. Either way, he would not leave. What happened that night is something the texts approach with great care, and because they are trying to describe something for which ordinary language is genuinely insufficient. What happened was not a vision exactly, or a series of revelations in the conventional sense. It was more like a sustained and deepening clarity, as though the mind in its stillness was becoming progressively more transparent, more able to see clearly what had always been there, but had been obscured by the constant turbulence of thought and grasping and fear. The figure of Mara appears in the tradition as the great tempter, the lord of death and desire, the embodiment of all the forces that keep human beings from awakening. You can understand Mara however you choose, as a literal being in a literal cosmology, or as a metaphor for the interior forces that resist transformation, the habits of mind that prefer familiar suffering to unfamiliar freedom. Either way, what Mara brought to the tree that night was in essence a series of gifts. First, he brought fear, storms, and terrible visions, and the entire vocabulary of terror. These are the gifts we all know. The heart suddenly loud at 3 in the morning, the imagination conjuring everything that can go wrong, The old voices that say you are not safe, you are not ready, you are not enough. The figure beneath the tree received none of them. Let them arrive and pass like weather. Then Mara brought Desire, his 3 daughters, 9, whose names in the Pali tradition are Tanha, Arati, and Raga, which translate roughly as craving, discontent, and passion. They brought comfort and beauty and the warmth of human connection, all the things that the years of asceticism had stripped away. They brought the offer of a return to ordinary life, ordinary pleasure, ordinary love. These are the gifts we all know too, the reaching back toward what is familiar, the pull of what is sweet and available, the voice that says you have suffered enough now. You can stop, you can rest in what you already have. The figure beneath the tree did not reach out his hand, not because he was cold, not because desire had been burned out of him, but because he could see. In the clarity of that night, with the river moving past him in the darkness, exactly what was being offered and exactly what accepting it would cost. He could see the beauty of what was held out to him, and he could see simultaneously and without contradiction that it was real and that it was impermanent, and that grasping it would not end the ache but only delay the moment when the ache returned with the added weight of loss. He left the gift where it was placed. Mara brought one final thing: doubt. Who are you, the voice said, to sit in this place? What makes you worthy? What gives you the right to claim what no one has claimed in uncountable ages? Show me your authority. Show me your credentials. Show me the evidence that you are not simply a man with a dream that is too large for you. And the man beneath the tree reached down and pressed his fingertips into the earth, just that. The lightest touch. Not a dramatic gesture, not a defiant proclamation. Just a man saying, this earth is my witness, this ground beneath me, this soil that has held uncountable lives, this earth that receives everything and remains. This is my authority. I am here. I am breathing. My roots go down into this ground. That is enough. The earth, the texts say, responded. The night opened. The stars wheeled overhead, Nanda, and something that had been closed for a very long time, in the interior of this one particular human being, gently and completely opened. By morning, the man who had sat down beside the river was not the same man who would rise from it. What had changed was not his face or his body or any of the visible things. None. What had changed was something in the deepest structure of how he understood experience, what it is, where it comes from, what can be done with it. The Pali tradition calls this state bodhi, from a root word meaning to awaken, understand, to know in the way that can never be unknowed. He sat for many days after that, moving through states of clarity so deep that the texts resort to silence when trying to describe them, and then gradually the question arose. What now? He had found something extraordinary, something that by its nature could not be kept private. Not because it demanded to be shared, but because its very essence was the recognition that the suffering he had been trying to understand was not his suffering alone. It was the suffering of every living thing that had ever been confused and afraid and unable to find a place to rest. He hesitated. The understanding he had reached was subtle and deep. The world was caught in the thick web of its own habits and assumptions. Would anyone be able to hear it? Would anyone want to? The story says that something turned him toward the world, a voice of compassion, whether interior or exterior. The texts leave open with characteristic wisdom that said, there are beings with only a little dust in their eyes. There are people suffering right now who would understand, who are looking for exactly this, without knowing what they are looking for. And so the newly awakened one rose from the earth beside the Naranjana river and straightened and began to walk. He walked west, toward the deer park at Isipatana near Varanasi, where the 5 ascetics who had left him in disgust were living. He found them there in the afternoon light, sitting together under the shade of trees. And when they saw him coming across the park, they agreed among themselves not to give him any particular respect. He had given up, they believed. He had returned to comfort. He was no longer worthy of the deference that serious practitioners owed each other. But when he arrived, something in the way he moved made their resolution dissolve before it could fully form. They stood. They offered him a seat. They brought water for his feet. He sat among them in the golden light of the late afternoon, and he began to tell them what he had found. That first teaching, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the setting in motion of the wheel of the Dhamma, was a gift. Perhaps the largest gift ever offered in the recorded history of human thought. And the 5 ascetics who received it sat very still and listened, and one by one, something in them recognized what they were hearing and opened to receive it. The wheel had begun to turn. Rest with this image for a moment before we move forward. The deer park in the afternoon light, and 6 people sitting together in the warm quiet of the Indian evening. 5 men who had walked away from a 6th, now sitting with him again, receiving something he had nearly kept to himself, a gift that almost wasn't given on, a teaching that nearly remained unspoken. And the world, all unknowing, going about its various businesses in every direction, changed forever by the decision of one man to open his hands. There is a question threading itself quietly through everything we have explored so far, and it is this: if the Buddha himself hesitated, if even the awakened one sat by the river and wondered whether the gift he carried was something anyone would want, what does that say about our own hesitations, about the things we carry that we are not sure are worth offering? We will return to that question many times tonight from many different directions. But for now, let the deer park settle into quiet. Let the afternoon light fade. Let the 5 ascetics sit in the new stillness of what they have just heard. We are going back now to the Jetavana Grove, back to the morning of Akkosa's visit and to what happened in the days that followed. And because Akkosa's story did not end when he placed his palms together and bowed, it was, in many ways, just beginning. And the thing that began in him that morning, the clearing, the settling, the gradual reopening of something that pride and grief had closed, is something that you may recognize from your own experience. Because pride closes things, grief closes things. The conviction that we have been wronged and that our anger about it is righteous closes things. And sometimes, not always, not by force, but sometimes, when we encounter something that simply refuses to fight back, something in us can begin, very slowly, to open again. The days that followed his encounter with the Buddha, Akkosa did something that was, for a man of his temperament, genuinely unusual. He went quiet, not the quiet of suppression, of a man who has swallowed his anger and is waiting for it to surface again with greater force. A different kind of quiet. The quiet of someone who is turning something over in his mind slowly and carefully, the way you turn an object in your hands when you are trying to understand what it is made of, how it was put together, why it holds together the way it does. The thing he was turning over was the Buddha's question: to whom does the gift belong if the one it is offered to does not receive it? It was, on its surface, a simple logical puzzle, and Akkosa had answered it correctly, immediately, without hesitation. He was a man trained in argumentation. He understood the structure of the question, but the simplicity of his own answer, it stays with the one who offered it, obviously, had lodged itself in him in a way that the question's apparent simplicity did not explain, because the answer meant something uncomfortable, meant that every time he had carried his anger toward someone who refused to be wounded by it, the anger had remained entirely his own. It had not transferred. It had not been distributed. It had stayed in his hands, and his hands alone, growing heavier with the carrying. He thought about the years of his brother's absence from the family. He thought about the resentment he had maintained through those years, carefully, almost lovingly maintained, feeding it with every imagined slight, every moment of comparing his own continuing responsibilities to what he perceived as his brother's irresponsible freedom. Now he thought about how much of his own energy he had spent building and rebuilding the case for why he was justified in feeling what he felt, and he thought about how none of that energy had in all those years moved a single thing in the actual world. His brother was still a monk. His parents were still aging. The morning still came and went. The mango trees still bore their fruit and dropped it, and he had spent years carrying a hot coal that he had never managed to throw at anyone, because the people he aimed it at were either absent or, as it turned out in the case of the Buddha, somehow not available to be burned on. There is a teaching in the Dhammapada, that beloved collection of verses that has been carried in the hearts of Buddhist practitioners for more than 2,000 years, that speaks directly to what Akkosa was beginning to understand. The Pali is Akkodanasa Silasa, which points toward the virtue of the one who does not repay anger with anger. None. The word for anger in Pali is koda, a word that suggests not just the emotion itself, but the way it spreads through a person, the way fire spreads through dry grass, consuming everything it touches, including the one it started in. Akkosa was beginning to feel, for the first time in a very long time, how much of himself the fire had consumed. He went back to the Jetavana 3 days later, not with a speech this time, with a question. He found the Buddha in the same place, or very nearly the same place, beneath another tree at the edge of the same clearing, which suggested either that the man had a preferred tree, or that he was genuinely, contentedly, exactly where he was, wherever he happened to be. Monks were moving past at the edges of the clearing. An older monk was sweeping a path nearby with a palm broom, the soft rhythmic sound of it like a kind of breathing. Akkosa sat down across from the Buddha without fanfare. He folded his hands in his lap. He looked at the ground for a moment, and then he looked up. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that I am not asking to argue. I am asking because I genuinely do not understand. That," the Buddha said, "is the best possible reason to ask. 3 days ago, when I came here full of anger, you were not angry with me, you were not afraid of me, and you were not contemptuous of me, and you were not performing patience in the way that people sometimes perform patience when they are actually very annoyed and simply managing it carefully. You were actually genuinely not disturbed. And I want to know how that is possible, because every person I have ever known, when addressed the way I addressed you, has either fought back or collapsed. You did neither. I cannot understand what you are made of that allows for that." The Buddha was quiet for a moment. The monk nearby continued his sweeping. The broom sound continued, soft and even. "There is a word in our language," the Buddha said, "for the practice of not receiving what is harmful. The word is khanti, usually translated as patience or forbearance, but those translations miss something. Khanti is not gritted teeth endurance. It is not counting to 10. It is something closer to a wide open field. When something that would normally wound you arrives, Khanti is the capacity to let it arrive into a space that is large enough to hold it without being defined by it. Not because you feel nothing, but because what you feel is no longer the only thing you are." "And how does one grow such a field?" Akkosa asked. "Because I do not seem to have one. I have apparently a very small room with very thin walls, and every harsh word arrives there like a stone through a window." The Buddha smiled. It was not a smile of superiority. It was the smile of someone who recognizes something they have also known. "You grow it," he said, "the way you grow anything that matters, slowly, by practice. By choosing one moment at a time, not to feed the fire, not suppressing it. Suppression builds pressure, and pressure eventually explodes. But by looking at the anger when it comes, seeing it clearly, understanding where it comes from and what it is actually asking for, and choosing not to add more fuel to it. And if I am not good at that, if every time I try the anger is faster than my intention, then you begin again," the Buddha said. "That is the entire practice, beginning again. There is no version of this that does not involve beginning again, many hundreds of times, probably for the rest of your life. The difference between the person who is practicing and the person who is not is simply that the practicing person begins again a little faster each time. The gap between the fire and the choice gradually narrows, eventually, and for some people the gap becomes wide enough that wisdom can step into it. Akkosa sat with this for a while. Around them the grove continued in its ordinary way. Somewhere beyond the trees, Avathi was going about its morning business. The market stalls opening, the water carriers making their rounds, the sounds of a city waking slowly into its own particular day. "My brother," Akkosa said finally, "Ahimsaka, is he well?" "He is practicing diligently," the Buddha said. "He asks about his family when he writes. He thinks of you." Something in Akkosa's face moved, a small involuntary movement, the kind that happens when feeling arrives faster than the defenses have time to arrange themselves. He nodded once and looked at the ground again. "I have spent a great deal of energy," he said quietly, "being angry on behalf of people who, it seems, do not need me to be angry for them. That is a thing many people discover," the Buddha said, "and the discovering of it is not nothing. It is, in fact, a very significant beginning, and there is something I want to pause over here in this conversation between two men sitting in a grove in the early morning of a very old world, because what is being described is not unique to Brahmins in ancient India. You have known Akkosa. You may have been Akkosa, arriving somewhere with a full set of grievances and prepared arguments, only to find that the situation did not respond the way you needed it to. That the person you had come to confront was somehow not available to be a villain. That the fight you had carefully prepared for did not materialize. And that without the fight, you were left standing alone with whatever it was you had actually been feeling underneath the anger all along. The underneath is usually where the real thing lives. The anger is almost always a roof over something more vulnerable. Nanda. In Akkosa's case, the roof was covering grief. Grief for a brother who had gone somewhere Akkosa could not follow. Grief for a version of their family that no longer existed. Grief, perhaps, for a version of the world that made sense to him and was quietly, steadily coming apart. The Buddha did not address the roof. He let Akkosa find his own way down to the underneath. That is itself a kind of teaching. The teaching of allowing a person to arrive at their own understanding rather than delivering the understanding pre-packaged. The Pali tradition has a word for this quality of teaching. Upaya, which means skillful, means the ability to offer the right thing at the right moment in the right form for the person who is right there in front of you. Not a formula. Not a script, not a response that grows from genuine attention to what this particular person in this particular moment actually needs. What Akkosa needed that first morning was not a lecture about anger, none. He needed to encounter something that anger could not touch, and once he had encountered it, the lecture was unnecessary. The experience had already done the teaching. What he needed on this second morning was not a reprimand, not a performance of forgiveness, and not a gentle speech about the importance of reconciling with his brother. He needed someone to sit with him while he found his own way to the question he had been circling for 3 days. No, what am I actually carrying and why? In the weeks that followed, Akkosa became what the texts call an upaska, a lay follower, someone who takes refuge in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, but does not take ordination as a monk. He kept his land, his household, his work. He did not shave his head or take up a robe. But something in the structure of his inner life began gradually to reorganize itself around a different center. He visited the Jetavana when he could. He listened. He practiced imperfectly and inconsistently, the beginning again that the Buddha had described. He found as the months passed that the small room with the thin walls seemed to be growing, slowly, unevenly, with setbacks and regressions, into something with slightly more space in it. He found that his anger arrived still, but with a slightly longer fuse, that the gap between the fire and the choice was, increment by increment, becoming wider. He wrote to his brother. The letter, if we imagine it, was probably short and probably awkward, because Akkosa was a man who had spent years maintaining a position, and stepping back from a position is always awkward. The way putting down a heavy thing is awkward, because your muscles have shaped themselves around the weight, and they do not immediately know what to do with their own emptiness. But he wrote, and his brother wrote back, and something that had been closed for a long time, a family, and in Akkosa himself, began, slowly, unevenly, without ceremony, to open. This is the last we see of Akkosa in the texts. He does not have a dramatic arc of complete transformation. He does not become enlightened, or give away all his possessions, or show up in any of the great scenes of the Buddha's ministry as a hero of the story. He is, in the end, a supporting character, a man who came to curse and left with something he had not expected, and who spent the rest of his ordinary life being slightly, gradually, imperfectly better at beginning again, which is, when you think about it, most of us. The fire does not go out all at once. The field does not grow overnight. The room does not become a field in a single conversation beneath a morning tree, but the conversation happens. The question plants itself, and the plant grows at its own pace, in the dark, the ordinary days that follow the extraordinary moment, in the small and unremarkable practice of choosing, one time, then another, then many years of another, not to add more fuel. That is enough. That is, in fact, the whole of it. Breathe slowly now. Let Akkosa's story settle into the deeper places of your rest. Let the Jetavana grow quiet around us. The morning light is moving. The monks are at their various practices. The man beneath the tree is sitting, still and rooted, as he has been and as he will continue to be, long after all of this particular morning is over. We are going to travel now to a different time, a different place, a different kind of grief. We are going to the story of a young woman who came to the Buddha carrying something heavier than anger. She was carrying the weight of the most ordinary and most devastating thing that can happen to a human being. She was carrying a dead child, and she came looking for a gift that the Buddha could not give her, and found, the refusal of that gift, something she could not have imagined. Her name was Kisa Gotami, and her story is one of the oldest and most beloved in the entire Buddhist tradition, not because it is comforting in the way we usually mean that word, but because it tells the truth about grief so clearly and so gently that the truth itself becomes, somehow, a comfort. Rest your breath. Let the grove fall away behind you. We are walking now on a road through the heat of a very old afternoon, toward the sound of a young woman crying. Her name meant Thin Gotami, Kisa meaning slender, almost frail, name that carried in it the hint of someone who had grown up without enough of something, enough food or enough warmth or enough of whatever it is that makes a person feel solid and safe in the world. She'd been born into a poor family in Savatthi, and she had married into a family of somewhat higher standing, which should have been a relief and perhaps was for a while. But her husband's family was not always kind to her. She was too poor for their tastes, too thin, too ordinary. They had expected more from the union, she knew this, in the particular way that young women in difficult households know the things that are never quite said aloud. They exist in the air of the place, in the pauses before the wrong people speak, in the quality of silence at mealtimes. And she had a son. Everything the texts say about what this child meant to Kisa Gotami is contained in a single observation, that with the birth of this boy, her position in the household changed. She was a mother. She was, at last, fully real to the people around her. The thin woman from the poor family had done the thing that mattered, had produced the thing that was required, and for a while, perhaps for several years, she had been happy in a way that she had not known was available to her. The child died. Suddenly, as young children die, one morning well and warm and reaching for things, another morning still and cool and no longer reaching for anything at all. The particular illness is not recorded in the texts. It does not matter. What matters is that Kisa Gotami picked up her dead son and carried him, and could not put him down. This is not a metaphor, she literally carried him. through the streets of Savatthi, going from house to house, asking neighbors and acquaintances and strangers if they had medicine that could help her child. People looked at her and at the child in her arms and understood immediately what she could not yet accept, and told her gently that there was nothing to be done. Some of them turned her away less gently than others. She kept walking. She kept asking. You understand at some level what was happening inside her. The mind, when it encounters something too large and too final and too wrong to be absorbed all at once, does not always absorb it all at once. It finds a task instead, a concrete, manageable task. Find the medicine. Get the help. Keep moving. No, doing is a way of not knowing what you already know. And Kisa Gotami walked through the city, carrying her child, doing. Someone, perhaps out of genuine compassion, perhaps simply to redirect her, perhaps because they had heard the teachers at the Jetavana speak and half remembered something useful, told her to go to the Buddha. He was wise, they said. He had healed many things. Perhaps he would know what to do. She went. She found the Buddha in the grove, as so many people found him, sitting in that particular stillness of his, available in a way that powerful people in those times rarely made themselves available. She stood before him with her dead child in her arms, and she asked him for medicine. He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the child. He did not flinch from looking, which was, by itself, unusual. Most people, and when confronted with a mother carrying her dead child through a city, looked away as quickly as possible. The finality of it was uncomfortable. The grief was too large, too raw, too close to something everyone was trying not to think about. The Buddha looked and did not look away. I know of a medicine, he said, that could help, but I will need an ingredient that only you can find. She gripped the child more tightly. Tell me. I will find anything. I need a mustard seed, he said. Just one. But it must come from a household that has never known death. A house where no one has died, not a parent, not a child, not a grandparent, not a servant, not anyone. Can you find such a house for me? She said yes. She was already turning to go. Now. There are some people who read this story and find the Buddha's instruction cruel. She came for help, and he sent her on an impossible errand. She was already in pain, and he gave her a task designed to deepen that pain before it could begin to lift. But sit with it for a moment. And because what the Buddha actually gave her was not a detour, he gave her a way to walk toward the truth of her situation rather than away from it. And he gave her company on that walk. Because every door she knocked on, every family she spoke to, would be a family that had known exactly what she was carrying. Every household would contain the same grief, wearing different faces, belonging to different people, not connected to different particular beloved names. She knocked on the first door. Did they have a mustard seed? Yes, of course. Had anyone in this household died? The woman at the door grew quiet. Her husband's father, 2 winters ago. She held the door open for Kisa Gotami, this thin woman with the child in her arms. Come in, sit down, let me give you some water. She knocked on another door. A young couple, a child newly born, happy, hopeful, not slightly harried in the way of new parents. Mustard seeds, yes, plenty. Had anyone died here? The young woman's face shifted, her mother, before the baby came. She never met her grandson. Come in, sit with us a moment. An old man's house, a wealthy merchant's gate, a narrow doorway with a lamp burning inside, a courtyard full of children, door after door after door. Every house had mustard seeds. Not one had been untouched by death. And as the afternoon moved toward evening, and Kisa Gotami's arms grew tired from carrying her child, and the city continued around her in its oblivious living way, people returning from their work, vendors closing their stalls, a smell of cooking fires beginning to rise from every home, something in her began to shift. She was not alone. She had believed in the acute privacy of grief, that she was the only person in the world who had ever felt this particular thing, that her loss was singular and impossibly personal, and separated her from the rest of humanity by a gap that nothing could bridge. But door by door, story by story, face by face, she was discovering the most difficult and most liberating thing that grief can reveal, that it is not singular, that every person walking through the city around her was carrying their own dead in one form or another, that the thin woman from the poor family who had lost her child was not separate from the world, but made of exactly the same substance as every other person who had ever loved something that did not last. The Pali word for this recognition, the experience of seeing your own suffering clearly reflected in the suffering of others, is the recognition at the heart of what the tradition calls karuna, compassion, literally suffering with. Karuna is not pity, which is the grief you feel for someone you perceive as beneath you or apart from you. And karuna is the grief you feel when you recognize that the person in front of you is made of the same substance as you, that what has happened to them could happen to you, that in some fundamental sense what has happened to them has happened to you because you are not as separate from each other as you thought. Kisa Gotami arrived at the edge of the city as the light was failing, and she stood there for a while with her child in her arms, looking back at the city and the 1,000 lights beginning to flicker in its windows, each light marking a house that contained both life and loss, that held both the warmth of the living and the memory of the gone. And slowly, gently, she laid her child down on the ground. She did not put him down because she loved him less. She put him down because she loved him enough to let what was true be true. He was gone. He had been gone since that still morning when she reached for him and found him cool. All the walking, all the doors, all the searching for what could not be found, none of it had been able to change that. And now she stood in the softening light of the city's edge, and she let herself know what she had already known all along. She went back to the Buddha in the gathering dark. He did not ask her whether she had found the mustard seed. He already knew she hadn't. He looked at her, instead, with the same quality of attention he had given Akkosa in the Jetavana Grove, the full, undefended, completely present kind of attention that most of us experience very rarely in our lives. "Did you find the seed?" he asked, because she needed him to ask, needed the question to exist so she could answer it. "No," she said. "I went to every house. Every single house had mustard seeds, and every single house had lost someone." She paused. "I am not the only one." "No," the Buddha said, "you are not the only one." She sat down. The dark was coming in around them. Somewhere in the grove, a night bird called once and fell silent. "What do I do now?" she asked. "You grieve," he said, "completely and honestly. You let the grief be exactly as large as it is, and you do not try to make it smaller or faster or more appropriate than it is. And you let it move through you the way a river moves. It cannot be dammed without damage, and it cannot be hurried, and it does not need to be. It will in its own time find its way to the sea." She sat for a long time. He sat with her. The night settled around them both. "And after," she said eventually, "after the river reaches the sea, there is a path," he said. "It does not remove the loss. Nothing removes the loss. But it leads, for those who walk it, to a place where loss is no longer the thing around which everything else organizes itself, where you can hold what you love with open hands, fully, tenderly, not completely, without the holding being a form of clutching, without the love being shadowed at every moment by the fear of its ending." "Open hands," she repeated. "Open hands," he said. Kisa Gotami became, the weeks that followed, a nun. She took ordination, shaved her head, took up the simple robe. She walked the path the Buddha described, slowly and with great commitment, not through the grief and out the other side of it, not to a place where her son had never died, not to a place where love did not ache, but to a place where she could hold the ache without being destroyed by it. And the texts record that she eventually reached the state the tradition calls arahantship, a complete awakening, a complete liberation from the structures of clinging and suffering. They record that when this happened, what she felt first was not triumph or relief, but a kind of vast, quiet gratitude. Gratitude for the grief even, for the doors she had knocked on, for the faces that had opened toward her in recognition, for the hands that had offered her water and company, and the small but immeasurable comfort of being told, "I have been here too. You are not alone." This is the gift the Buddha gave Kisa Gotami, and it was not medicine. It was not the reversal of loss. It was not a mustard seed from a house that had never known death, because no such house exists, and offering her the fantasy of one would have been a cruelty disguised as kindness. The gift he gave her was the truth offered in a form she could walk through rather than be crushed by. The gift of a journey that moved her toward reality rather than away from it at exactly the pace her grief required. And there is a question that lives inside Kisa Gotami's story that I want to place gently in the air between us before we move forward. It is this: what are you carrying right now that you have not yet been able to put down? And it does not have to be grief as large as hers. It does not have to be a child or a death or a loss that other people would recognize immediately as devastating. Sometimes what we carry is smaller than that, in the way that a stone in a shoe is smaller than a boulder, and yet, walked on long enough, it changes the way you move through the world entirely. Whatever you are carrying, you do not have to put it down tonight. You do not have to resolve anything or understand anything or arrive anywhere. But if somewhere in the long quiet of this night, as the stories continue to move around you, something softens, if something held very tight allows itself to loosen even a little, know that this is not nothing. This is the river finding its way. Kisa Gotami sat in the dark with the Buddha in the grove where the night bird had called once and fallen silent. She had laid something down that she had been carrying since morning. Her arms were empty, her arms were free, and somewhere in the city behind her, every house with a lit window, life continued in its ordinary, devastating, irreplaceable way. Let your breath be slow, let the night be soft. There is no hurry anywhere in this story. And there is no hurry anywhere in you. And we are going to move now toward a different kind of difficulty. Not the grief of losing what we love, but the more surprising difficulty of giving. The story of a king who was so devoted to generosity that his generosity became, in its own way, a form of grasping. A man who gave and gave and gave and who had to learn eventually that even generosity can become a chain if we are not careful about what we attach to it. His name was Pasenadi. He was the king of Kosala, and he is about to do something very grand and very misguided and very, very human. Rest your breath. Let the grove settle into quiet. The next chapter is coming, soft as the night around you. Easy as the next slow exhale. The king who could not stop giving, King Pasenadi of Kosala, was by any reasonable measure a good man. He was not always a wise man. He was not always a patient man. He was sometimes vain and sometimes cowardly and sometimes prone to the particular kind of blundering that comes from having too much power and not quite enough self-knowledge to know what to do with it. But he was generous. Nanda. Genuinely, consistently, sometimes extravagantly generous, in a way that his treasury ministers found alarming and his citizens found reassuring, and the Buddha, when he thought about it, found both admirable and instructive. Nanda. Pasenadi had been giving things away since he was a child. Sweets from the palace kitchen distributed to servants' children in the courtyard. Fine cloth passed through the bars of his father's audience chamber to petitioners standing in the heat. Later, as king, food for pilgrims, land for temples, money for the relief of drought and flood and the ordinary grinding poverty that existed just beyond the walls of every prosperous city in ancient India. He built wells and rest houses along the roads. He endowed scholarships for young students from poor families. He funded the construction of more than one monastery, including, most significantly, contributions to the Jetavana, where the Buddha had now been teaching for several years. He came to the Jetavana regularly. He sat with the Buddha. He asked questions. He listened. And he went away and thought about what he had heard, and came back with more questions. He was, in the language of the time, a devoted lay follower, a man who had taken refuge in the triple gem of the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, and who genuinely tried to live accordingly. And yet, there is a quality in excessive giving that is easy to miss from the outside because it looks, from the outside, exactly like virtue. It looks like the beautiful opposite of greed. It looks like the visible form of a generous heart, which is a thing the world genuinely needs more of. But sometimes, not always, not in everyone who gives, but sometimes the giving is doing something else underneath the surface. Sometimes it is carrying, concealed inside the beautiful gesture of the open hand, a very tight grip. The grip of wanting to be the kind of person who gives. The grip of the identity of the generous one. The grip of the relief that comes from action, from doing something, anything, in the face of the helplessness and impermanence that all of us, kings included, eventually have to face. Pasenadi had grown up with the fear that is specific to those born into great wealth and power, the fear that without the wealth and power, there would be nothing of them worth loving, that the gifts were the proof of the worth, that the open hand was necessary, not as an expression of genuine abundance, but as a constant demonstration that abundance existed. Give enough and you are safe. Give enough and you matter. Give enough, and the terrible uncertainty at the center of being human is kept at bay, at least for another day. The story that crystallizes this comes from the Dakinavibanga Sutta and various commentarial sources that expand on it. And Pasenadi had organized a great giving ceremony, a Dana festival of extraordinary scale, something he had been planning for months, something intended to be the largest and most impressive public act of generosity the kingdom had ever seen. Hundreds of cattle were prepared as gifts, fine cloth in quantities that would clothe an entire city, gold and silver, and food enough to feed the population of Savatthi for weeks. He came to the Buddha before the ceremony, seeking the blessing of the teacher he respected most in the world. And the Buddha asked him a question, gently, the way he always asked the questions that mattered. "For whom are you giving, Pasenadi?" The king blinked. For the poor, for the pilgrims, for the Sangha, for the gods if such beings receive offerings, known for the welfare of the kingdom. And for whom underneath all of those? The Buddha asked. Pasenadi was quiet for a moment. He was an honest man, whatever his other limitations, and honesty requires a moment of interior checking when the question is genuinely uncomfortable. "For myself," he said. "I suppose underneath all of it, for myself. What does the giving do for you?" The Buddha asked, not with judgment, with the genuine curiosity of someone who wants to understand rather than correct. The king thought about this for a longer moment. "It makes me feel," he said slowly, "that I am doing something, that I have the capacity to affect the world, that my presence here has some weight, some consequence." He paused again. "That I am not entirely helpless. There is nothing wrong with any of that," the Buddha said. The wish to contribute, to matter, to leave some mark of care on the world. These are not shameful things. They are, in fact, movements of the same compassionate impulse that the Dhamma teaches us to cultivate. "But," said Pasenadi, because he could hear the shape of what was coming even before it arrived, "but dana, true generosity, giving in the deepest sense, is most complete when it is free of the need for what it produces, when the gift is given and then released. Not just the object of the gift, but the identity of the giver. Not just the cloth or the gold or the food, but the story you are telling yourself about the kind of man you are because you gave them." Pasenadi sat with this. Outside the window of the room where they were meeting, preparations for the great ceremony were continuing, the sounds of cattle and cloth and servants moving in organized purpose through the palace grounds. "That sounds," he said, "like giving nothing." And "It sounds like nothing because we are so used to giving as transaction," the Buddha said. "Give this, receive that, even if what you receive is not gold, but the feeling of being someone who gives gold." And true dana is not a transaction. It is more like breathing out. You breathe out without expecting to be credited for the breath. The breath simply leaves you, and because it does, there is space for the next one to come in. And can a person actually do that? Pasenadi asked. Give without holding anything. Give without it meaning something about who they are. It is a practice, the Buddha said. Like everything else, you begin where you are. You give, and you notice what you are holding on to in the giving. and you practice loosening your grip on that. Not all at once, not through force, but gradually. The way a hand slowly opens when the tension in it is gently released. There is a term in the Pali tradition for what the Buddha was describing, anupadadana, a compound that suggests giving without clinging to the giving. The ana prefix removes attachment. Upada refers to grasping. Dana is generosity. Giving without grasping at the gift, the giver, or the giving. The hand that opens and stays open, without watching to see what comes back through it. This is for most of us a genuinely difficult practice. We are trained from very early in our lives to understand giving as something that reflects on us. The generous child is praised. The stingy child is corrected. The adult who gives to charity is admired. The adult who doesn't is judged. The entire social architecture around giving is built on the premise that the giver matters. That who gives and how much and to whom and on what occasions is information about the quality of that person's character. And it is. That part is real. Generosity does reflect something important about a person's character. But the reflection is only clear when the giving flows from genuine abundance rather than from the need to prove abundance. Then the hand opens because it is truly open, not because it is performing openness for an audience, including the interior audience of the self. Pasenadi went ahead with his ceremony. He gave away the cattle and the cloth and the gold and the food on the scale he had planned, and the people of Savatthi received it with gratitude. It was, by external measures, a success. Hundreds of families ate well. None. Pilgrims and monks who had been walking from distant provinces arrived to find gifts waiting for them. The city was, for several days, genuinely warmer and more nourished than it had been. But Pasenadi noticed something in himself as the ceremony unfolded. He noticed that he was watching, not just participating in the giving, but monitoring it, monitoring the reactions of the recipients, and monitoring whether the scale of it was landing with appropriate impressiveness. Monitoring whether his reputation as the great Dana king of Kosala was being appropriately augmented by the day's events. The hand was open, but something behind the hand was keeping very close track of everything that passed through it. He went back to the Buddha the following day, slightly sheepish. "I watched myself watching," he said. "That is the beginning of the real practice," the Buddha said. "Not the giving. The noticing. It is uncomfortable noticing," said Pasenadi. "Most true things are at first," the Buddha said. "Comfort usually lives in the familiar, and the familiar is usually whatever we have been doing longest. The uncomfortable thing is almost always the more honest thing. So what do I do with the watching? You keep noticing it. You don't punish yourself for it. You don't try to force it away. You simply observe it the way you might observe clouds passing through a sky. Yes, there is the desire to be seen as generous. Yes, there is the relief of action. Yes, there is the comfort of the identity. And underneath all of those, underneath the watching and the tracking and the storytelling, is there something else? Something quieter. Something that gives simply because the person in front of you is cold and you have cloth." Pasenadi sat very still. "Sometimes," he said, "not always, but sometimes cultivate that," the Buddha said. "The rest will gradually follow." What the Buddha was pointing to, beneath all the nuance and the careful instruction, is something very simple. There is a moment in some acts of giving when the story falls away entirely. When you are not the generous king or the good person or the responsible citizen or any other role the mind constructs around the act of opening the hand. When you are simply someone who has something and someone else needs it, something moves from one to the other, and that is the complete account of what happened. No story, no credit, no mirror. Just the breath out and then the next breath in. Pasenadi never, by all accounts, completely mastered this. He remained to the end of his life a man who gave with one hand and watched the giving with the other, which makes him, it must be said, extremely recognizable, not a saint, not a villain, and a person in the middle of a practice, improving unevenly, keeping at it anyway. which is, in the end, all any of us are doing. Let the king's story settle now. Let his wide palace and his great ceremony and the small, honest confession I watched myself watching fall into the quiet around you. You are breathing slowly. Your body is soft. The night is doing its patient work around you. There is one thing I want to leave with you from Pasenadi's story before we move on. It is not about how to give more or how to give with less ego or any prescription for correct behavior. It is simpler than that. It is the image of the breath. You breathe out and the breath leaves you, and you do not chase it. You do not keep track of where it goes. You do not add it to a record of all the breaths you have given to the air. It simply leaves, and the leaving makes room, and the room fills again, and the cycle continues without your management. This is what generosity looks like when it is fully alive. This is what love looks like when it is not afraid. This is what an open hand looks like when the story of the hand has been set aside. Breathe out slowly now, all the way. Feel the emptiness at the end of the exhale, the moment before the next breath comes in. Rest in that moment for as long as it offers itself. Then breathe in again, easy as rain. We are going now to a very different story. We are going to an island, or rather, onto a region so remote and so reputedly fierce that the monks of the early Sangha referred to it with something between wariness and awe. We are going to meet a man named Punna, who volunteered to go somewhere no one wanted to go, and give something that everyone else was afraid to give. His story is about the courage hidden inside genuine nonviolence, and it begins with a question the Buddha asked him that is one of the sharpest and most clarifying questions in the entire Pali Canon. His name was Punna Mantaniputta, and he was, by the time of this story, already considered one of the great Dhamma teachers of the early Sangha. He had a gift for explanation, for taking the subtle and difficult insights of the Buddha's teaching and finding the words that made them suddenly, unexpectedly clear to whoever he was speaking with. The texts record that the Buddha himself praised Punna's capacity for teaching in the most direct terms, listing him among the foremost of his monk disciples in this particular quality. That was not a small thing. The early Sangha contained extraordinary people, scholars and meditators and teachers of remarkable ability, and to be named foremost among them in any quality was to be placed in rare company. But Punna, for all his gifts, was not a man content to teach in comfortable circumstances. No, he was not interested in the well-appointed monasteries near the great cities, where the audiences were educated and receptive and unlikely to respond badly to a teaching on the nature of impermanence. He was drawn out, for reasons the texts do not fully explain, toward the difficult places, toward the people who had not yet heard or who had heard and pushed back, or who were living in conditions so removed from the rarefied world of the Dhamma halls that carrying a teaching there felt like attempting to light a lamp in a gale. He came to the Buddha one morning and told him he wanted to go to Sunaparanta. The Buddha looked at him for a moment. Sunaparanta was a region. The texts place it somewhere in western India, toward the coast, though the exact geography has been debated by scholars for centuries, known primarily for the volatility of its people. The word the Pali sources use is Akkodana, which means something like prone to anger, though that translation is too mild. And the people of Sunaparanta had a reputation for responding to the presence of wandering monks with precisely the opposite of the respectful attention that monks typically received in the more settled regions of the Ganges plain. They were known to shout, to mock, to throw things, occasionally to become physically threatening. No monk had yet succeeded in establishing a meaningful teaching presence there. Several had tried. Several had come back quickly. Punna wanted to go. Punna, the Buddha said, the people of Sunaparanta are fierce. They are rough and harsh. If you go there and they revile you and insult you with harsh words, what will you do? I will think to myself, Punna said that they are good people, for at least they did not throw clods of earth at me. The Buddha looked at him steadily. And if they do throw clods of earth at you, I will think they are good people. And for at least they did not strike me with sticks. And if they strike you with sticks, I will think they are good people, for at least they did not strike me with weapons, and if they strike you with weapons, I will think they are good people, for at least they did not deprive me of life. And if they do deprive you of life," Punna was quiet for a moment, not because he was afraid, or not only because of that, but because he was settling into the full depth of what he was about to say, making sure it was true before he said it. "I will think," he said, "that they are very good people. None. For there are those in this world who seek sharp weapons with which to end their lives, and the people of Sunaparanta will have done this for me without any effort on my part." The grove was quiet for a long moment, and the Buddha said, "Well done, Punna. With such perfect endurance you are fit to dwell in the country of Sunaparanta. Go now, Punna. You are freed. Go and free others." None. This exchange, recorded in the Punovada Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya, is one of the most striking in the entire Pali Canon, and I want to stay with it for a moment before we follow Punna to the coast, because it contains something that is easy to misread. It might look on the surface like a teaching about the acceptance of violence, like a prescription for passivity in the face of harm, like the Buddha endorsing in some way the idea that a person of genuine spiritual attainment simply absorbs whatever is done to them without resistance. That is not what is happening here. What is happening is something more precise and more interesting. The Buddha is testing not Punna's willingness to be hurt, but the depth and stability of his equanimity. He is asking, at what point does the mind tip from the spacious field of upekkha, that wide-open quality we encountered with Akkosa's story, into reactivity? None. At what point does the provocation become large enough to find the edge of the equanimity and go over it? Punna's answers show him checking the edge honestly at each level of escalation. He is not pretending that the harm would not be harm. He is not claiming that being struck with a weapon would be pleasant. And he is simply, and this is the genuinely extraordinary thing, genuinely unable to find a point at which the harm from outside would be worse than the harm he would do to himself by responding to it with hatred. Because that is what the alternative is. The alternative to bearing the hostility of the people of Sunaparanta is not some pleasant middle option. The alternative is responding to their anger with his own, which is the thing the Dhamma teaches most consistently is the greatest source of suffering in human life. Not what is done to us, but what we do in response to what is done to us, what we add to the situation from the inside. This is the teaching about the gift that is refused in its most extreme form. The people of Sunaparanta would offer Punna their anger, their contempt, their violence, and Punna, like in the grove with Akkosa, would simply not take it, would leave it where it was placed. Not through suppression, not through performance, not through gritted teeth endurance, but through a quality of mind so genuinely spacious that the provocation, however large, would not find the edges of it. Punna went to Sunaparanta. What happened there is told with wonderful brevity in the texts. He arrived, he settled in the area, he began to teach, speaking to whoever would listen in the same clear, accessible way he had always taught. And the people of Sunaparanta, who had a reputation as impervious to monks and their messages, responded. Not immediately, not uniformly, not without the difficulties and confrontations that the region was known for. But something in the quality of Punna's presence, something in the way a man who has genuinely made peace with his own mortality moves through the world, the way someone with nothing to protect expresses a freedom that is visible even to those who cannot name what they are seeing, opened something in the people he encountered. And the texts record that by the end of that single rains retreat, a period of roughly 3 months during which monks traditionally stayed in one place during the monsoon season, 500 men and 500 women had become lay followers of the Dhamma in Sunaparanta. The fierce people of the fierce country had received something they had not previously been offered, a teacher who arrived without armor, who carried no defenses, who had nowhere to retreat to, and therefore stood fully exactly the place he was. This is the paradox at the center of genuine nonviolence. and it is one that the word nonviolence does not fully capture. What Punna brought to Sunaparanta was not simply the absence of aggression. It was the presence of something, a quality of being so settled, so rooted, so genuinely unafraid of what could happen to him, that it created, in whatever room or courtyard or dusty road he occupied, a kind of gravitational field. People drew near to it the way people are drawn to a fire in cold weather, not because they understand the warmth before they feel it, but because something in them recognizes, wordlessly, that heat is what they have been missing. The gift Punna brought to Sunaparanta was himself, fully, openly, without reservation or protection. And the gift the people of Sunaparanta gave back to him, eventually, gradually, without fully understanding what they were doing, was the willingness to receive it. There is something in Punna's story that speaks to a particular kind of difficulty that many of us carry. Not the difficulty of being in danger. Most of us are not in the kind of physical danger that Punna was willing to walk into, but the difficulty of entering hostile territory of a subtler kind. The conversation we have been avoiding, the relationship where the other person has demonstrated more than once that they respond to openness with contempt. The situation where every previous attempt to connect has been met with something that felt, to our nervous system, like being pelted with clods of earth, or worse. Punna's teaching is not that we should endlessly absorb harm. It is that the quality of our own inner space determines what the harm can do to us. And the quality of that inner space can be cultivated, not through toughening, not through building better walls, but through the opposite of walls, through the gradual, patient, practice by practice widening of the field. The people of Sunaparanta could not wound what Punna had become, not because he was invulnerable, but because he was genuinely, deeply at peace, and that peace, that open, undefended, fully present peace, was more interesting to them in the end than their own anger. Rest there for a moment in the image of the wide field, and in the quality of a mind that has found its footing so fully that even the roughest terrain does not knock it over. In the possibility, genuinely available, genuinely cultivable, not reserved for monks with exceptional gifts, of meeting hostility with something other than more hostility. Breathe slowly. The night is deep now and soft around you. The stories are doing their slow work. We are going now to a darker story, a story that begins not in a grove or a palace or a distant coastal province, but on a road, a forest road where something terrible was happening for a long time, before the Buddha came walking along it. Alone, as he almost never was, and with full knowledge of what he was walking toward. The man at the center of this story wore a garland of fingers around his neck. His name was Angulimala, which means exactly what it sounds like. And what the Buddha did when he met him on that road is one of the most radical acts of unconditional compassion in the entire history of human storytelling. Before we go into this story, I want to say something directly to you in the quiet of this night. This chapter contains darkness, not gratuitous darkness, not darkness for its own sake, but the real kind, a kind that exists in human experience and that the Buddhist tradition has never flinched from naming clearly. The story of Angulimala is a story about violence and about what violence is made of, and about whether there is a version of compassion wide enough to include even those who have done the worst things that people do to each other. It is also one of the most beautiful stories in the Pali Canon. Both of these things are true at the same time. Let yourself settle a little more deeply as we begin. Let the weight of the night hold you. The story will not ask you to do anything except listen. His birth name was Ahimsaka, the harmless one. The same name, note, though perhaps coincidentally, as Akkosa's brother. Ahimsaka was born in the kingdom of Kosala to a family of the Brahmin caste, and from the beginning he was extraordinary. Extraordinarily gifted, his teachers said. Extraordinarily beautiful, people noticed. Extraordinarily bright, with the kind of mind that absorbs learning the way dry earth absorbs rain, immediately, completely, without apparent effort. He was sent to Tuxila, the great university city in the northwest, to study with one of the most celebrated teachers of the age, and he was the best student his teacher had ever had. This is where the trouble began, because brilliance, when it is genuinely exceptional, attracts resentment as reliably as it attracts admiration. The other students noticed that the teacher's best attention went to Ahimsaka, and the teacher's wife noticed it too, and the commentarial literature adds a detail that has been debated by scholars but is consistent with the psychological logic of the story. And she developed a dangerous attachment to the brilliant young student, and when he did not respond as she wished, she reversed the narrative entirely. She went to her husband and told him that Ahimsaka had been inappropriate with her, that the student he had elevated above all others had betrayed his trust. The teacher could have dismissed his star pupil directly, could have sent him home, but there is a particular cruelty that sometimes manifests in people who have been genuinely wronged or who believe they have been genuinely wronged, which is the same thing from the inside. And that cruelty involves the engineering of the other person's destruction through indirect means rather than direct confrontation. The teacher, instead of expelling Ahimsaka, devised a graduation task. He told his student that the final teaching, the knowledge that would complete his education, required the collection of 1,000 human fingers, gathered as trophies of 1,000 kills. And only then would the teacher consider his education complete. There is no rational way to make this instruction defensible. Even within the moral framework of the time, it was unconscionable. But Ahimsaka, who had devoted years of his life to this teacher, who revered him, who had built his entire identity around being the teacher's most excellent student, heard this instruction as the final, necessary, legitimate demand of the man he trusted most in the world. He went into the forest of Kosala. He began to kill. The texts do not linger on the details of what happened in the Jalini forest during the years that followed. Neither will we. What we know is that Ahimsaka killed and collected his trophies and became something so feared that the kingdom of Kosala was effectively disrupted by his presence. People stopped traveling the forest roads. Villages near the forest were abandoned. King Pasenadi himself organized military expeditions to deal with the threat, and the expeditions failed. And the man in the forest, who by now was wearing a garland of the fingers he had collected, and who had acquired the name Angulimala, finger garland, seemed, to those who encountered and survived him, less like a human being than like a force of nature. Implacable, unstoppable, entirely beyond the reach of ordinary intervention. He was one finger short of 1,000 when the Buddha walked into the forest alone. His attendants tried to stop him. Monks, lay people, passers-by who were going in the opposite direction. Everyone who saw where he was heading warned him. A killer lived in that forest, a man who had murdered hundreds, and from whom armies had fled. The road was death. The Buddha walked in. The texts record Angulimala seeing the lone figure on the path and moving toward it, thinking, "One more and I am done. One more and the task is complete. One more, and whatever this terrible chapter of my life has been, it will be over." He started running. And here is the moment that generations of Buddhist teachers and artists and storytellers have returned to again and again, because it is so strange and so exact and so perfectly itself. The Buddha was walking at his normal pace, and Angulimala running with all the physical capability of a man who had spent years in harsh conditions, who was fit and practiced and motivated in the most urgent way, could not catch him. He ran harder. The distance between them did not close. He shouted, "Stop, monk, stop!" And the Buddha, still walking, said over his shoulder, "Then, I have stopped, Angulimala. You are the one who has not stopped." Angulimala stopped running. He stood on the road in the forest that had been his domain for years, breathing hard, completely confounded by a statement that he could not immediately parse, but that he felt, somewhere in the middle of his chest, was the most important thing anyone had said to him in a very long time. "What do you mean?" he asked. "You are the one who is moving. I am the one standing still." I stopped, the Buddha said, turning now, facing him. Long ago, from harming living beings, you have not yet stopped. The Pali word here is niruddho, ceased, stopped, come to rest. The Buddha is playing on multiple meanings simultaneously, the physical stopping of movement and the inner stopping of harmful action. And beneath both of those, the deepest stopping, the cessation of the craving and aversion and confusion that are the ultimate root of all harmful action. He has stopped. He has come to rest. Angulimala is still running, even when he is standing still, because the thing that drives him has not yet been laid down. Angulimala stood in the road for a long time. What passed through him in those moments, the texts do not fully say, but something in the clarity of what the Buddha had said, and perhaps something in the very fact that this man had walked into the forest alone, without fear, without a weapon, without anything except his own absolute settledness, broke through the years of isolation and violence, and the terrible task and the identity that had calcified around all of it. He threw down his sword, and he cut the garland from his neck. He sat down on the forest road in the dirt and the leaf litter, and when the Buddha came close and sat near him, he wept. He wept the way a person weeps when something that has been sealed very tight for a very long time finally at last finds its way open, not cleanly, not with dignity, but completely. I want to stop, he said. Then stop, said the Buddha. Angulimala was ordained that day in the forest with the most minimal ceremony the tradition allows, just the words, just the commitment, just the robe that the Buddha provided from his own spare cloth. He became a monk. What followed was not easy. The Pali texts do not sentimentalize it. Angulimala walked into Savatthi for his morning alms round, and the people of the city recognized him and pelted him with stones and clods of earth. He returned to the Buddha with his robe torn and his head bleeding, and the Buddha said to him, "Bear it, Angulimala. Endure it. Now, what is coming to you now is a fraction of what the results of your actions could have been across many lifetimes, and it is arriving in this life instead, in this manageable form. Bear it with patience, and it will pass." He bore it. There is one more episode from Angulimala's story that I want to bring to you before we leave him, because it is the completion of his transformation in the most human and most moving form. Now he was walking on his alms round one morning, and he heard from inside a house he was passing the sound of a woman in difficult labor. The birth was going badly. She had been in labor for days. The family was frightened. Angulimala stood outside the door of that house and felt, for the first time in years, the full weight of what he had done in the forest. He had taken life. He had taken it from people who were in exactly the position this woman was in, people in the midst of their lives, needing help, frightened, reaching for something, and he had been the one who ended the reaching. And he went to the Buddha. "What can I do?" he asked. "I cannot undo what I have done. But this woman is suffering, and she is right there in front of me, and I want to help her, and I do not know how." The Buddha gave him words, a truth declaration in the Pali tradition, a statement of fact so pure and so grounded in reality that it carries, when spoken with full sincerity, a kind of moral force. The formula in English is something like, "Nod. Since I was born into noble birth, sister, I have never intentionally taken the life of any living being. By this truth may you be well, may your infant be well." "But this is not true," Angulimala said. "I have taken many lives. I cannot honestly make this declaration." "It is true," the Buddha said, "since your noble birth. The Angulimala who walked into the forest with a sword is not the Angulimala who is standing here asking how to help a woman in labor. And something has died between those two moments, and something has been born. The declaration is true. Go and speak it." He went to the door of the house. He sat near the woman in labor, and he spoke the words, quietly, steadily, with the full sincerity of a man who knew exactly what he had been, and knew with equal clarity what he was now. The labor resolved. The child was born healthy, and whether this was miracle or coincidence or the body's response to the presence of genuine peace in a frightened room, the texts do not say, and perhaps it does not matter. What matters is the image, Man who had worn a garland of the harm he had done to others, now sitting at the bedside of a woman who needed help, speaking words of healing and meaning them completely. The gift Angulimala gave that woman was not extraordinary by any material measure. It was words, it was presence, it was the accumulated weight of a transformation that had cost him everything he had previously understood himself to be. And the gift the Buddha had given Angulimala, the gift he had walked alone into a dangerous forest to offer, was the most radical gift in this entire night of stories. Not forgiveness, exactly. And because the tradition does not suggest that the Buddha had the authority to forgive on behalf of Angulimala's victims, but something like the recognition of possibility. The insistence demonstrated by walking unarmed and unafraid down a forest road that the person who had done all of those things was not fixed, was not finished, was not beyond the reach of whatever in human beings is capable of change. This is the widest interpretation of the open hand, not the open hand of giving objects or teachings or the gift of non-retaliation, the open hand of refusing to close around a person and tell them they are only what they have done. Rest with Angulimala's story. Let it settle in the deep places of your rest. Do not try to draw lessons from it or apply it to anything. Just let the image of a man in a forest sit with you. A man who ran toward one more victim and could not close the gap, and who finally, breathlessly, stopped and sat down in the dirt and let something new begin. There is a great deal of night still ahead of us, and the next story is a quieter one, smaller in scale, more domestic, closer to the texture of ordinary life. It is the story of a lamp, a very small lamp belonging to a very poor woman that burned so brightly it could not be put out by people who should have been able to extinguish it easily. The story of why will tell you something important about the nature of genuine giving. Not grand giving, not royal giving, not giving that requires a ceremony or an audience or even much material to give. Giving from the place in us that has nothing to lose because it has already let go of everything. On the night that this story takes place, the road leading to the place where the Buddha would teach was lined with lamps. This was not unusual on such nights. When a teacher of great reputation was to give a major discourse, particularly one attended by the king, it was customary for wealthy households and devout lay followers to make offerings of light. Oil lamps, butter lamps, torches of fragrant wood. The road would glow for the length of a great festival, and the light was itself a form of generosity, a making visible of the path for all who needed to walk it. On this particular night, King Pasenadi had contributed lamps of exceptional quality. Merchants had contributed. Influential families had contributed. The road was bright with the offerings of people who had much to give and gave it in the customary proportions. Among the people making their way toward the teaching that evening was a woman named Nanda, and the texts describe her as a widow, old and very poor. She had one coin. Some translations say it was a single copper piece, the smallest unit of currency in that time and place, worth less by any material measure than the oil in most of the lamps already burning along the road. She went to the oil merchant and asked for enough oil for a small lamp. And the merchant looked at the single coin and looked at the woman and gave her what the coin could purchase, which was a very small amount of oil indeed. Enough perhaps for a lamp that would burn for an hour or two. He made a small lamp, a simple clay dish with a wick, and she placed it on the road with the others, and then she offered something else. Her intention. The Pali term for what she offered along with the oil is satana, usually translated as intention or volition, the mental quality that accompanies and shapes an action and determines, in the Buddhist understanding, much of its moral weight. Nanda's satana was described in the commentaries with great care. She was not giving from abundance. She had nothing else. This lamp was not a contribution to a collection that would continue without her. It was, in the most literal sense, everything she had, and she offered it with a clarity and a wholeness that the texts suggest is rare even among people who give a great deal. She thought, "This is all I have, I offer it completely." Not for recognition, not for merit that I am counting up, not for anything in return. I offer it because the light is needed, and I have oil enough for one small lamp, and one small lamp is what I can give. She walked home. The night deepened. The teaching went on. And around the third watch of the night, deep in the early hours before dawn, a time when the breath slows and the city goes entirely quiet, one of the monks assisting with the space began extinguishing the lamps as the oil in them ran out. He moved methodically along the road with a fan, dousing the lamps one by one as they guttered and went dark. He reached Nanda's lamp, he fanned it. It did not go out, he fanned it harder. The flame moved with the wind and straightened again. He tried covering it with his palm. None. The lamp burned on, small and steady and entirely unimpressed by the monk's repeated attempts. He went to Anuruddha, one of the senior monks known in the tradition for his exceptional abilities and attainments, and reported that there was a lamp on the road that he could not extinguish. Anuruddha came and looked at the lamp. He tried. It did not go out. The story is told in the commentarial literature with a kind of wonder that the writers clearly felt no need to explain or rationalize. Something in this lamp was not extinguishable by ordinary means, and the explanation offered, not as metaphysics but as the straightforward description of a principle, is that the quality of intention with which it had been offered had made it in some sense more than what it was materially, that the wholeness of the giving had entered the flame, and the flame burned with the quality of that wholeness. You can understand this story in different ways, and all of them are, I think, true in their own register. At the literal level, if you take the tradition's cosmological framework seriously, the story says that genuine generosity, giving that arises from completeness rather than from calculation, generates a kind of merit that has effects in the world beyond what the material substance of the gift would suggest. And at the psychological level, the story says something that you can feel the truth of without any cosmological commitments at all. That the quality of attention and intention we bring to what we do matters. That a thing done with full presence and full commitment carries something that the same thing done distractedly or partially does not carry. That Nanda's lamp burned with something beyond its oil because she had put something beyond oil into the lighting of it. And at the level of pure poetry, which is perhaps the level that speaks most clearly to something sleeping in you tonight. The story says that the smallest light given from the deepest place will not go out easily. That what we offer from our genuine center, from the place in us that has truly released its grip on outcome and identity and the story of the giver, has a staying power that is disproportionate to its material size. Morning after the night of the lamps, Nanda was walking past the road where the teaching had been. The lamps were all out. The road was ordinary in the morning light, except there was one small clay dish with a wick in it, still burning with a small, steady flame. She stood and looked at it for a moment. The texts say she felt something that is described as piti, a Pali word for a quality of joy that is not excitement or elation but something quieter and more stable. The joy of having done something whole, not the joy of having nothing to regret, the joy perhaps of being someone who has given everything they had and discovered that what was left, the empty hands, the empty purse, none, the ordinary morning, was somehow not diminished by the giving. This is the paradox that the tradition returns to again and again, from different angles, in different stories, with different characters and different circumstances, and always the same quiet insistence. The open hand does not become empty. The hand that gives everything discovers that giving everything does not make it nothing. That the river that empties itself into the sea does not thereby cease to be a river. Nanda was, by external measures, poorer than ever on that morning. The single copper coin was gone, the oil was burned, the lamp still glowing on the road would eventually go out. Nothing material had been added to her life by what she had done. And yet, let the lamp burn for a moment in the dark behind your closed eyes. Let it be small and steady and warm. Let it ask you nothing, require nothing, demand nothing. Let it simply be there, a point of light in a large darkness, burning with the quality of someone who gave everything they had and felt the giving, as though they had somehow gained the only thing that had ever truly mattered. Rest now, the night is holding you softly. The lamp is still burning. We are going to go somewhere unexpected next. We are going to go beyond the living world, into the territory that the Buddhist tradition calls the realm of the Pitas, the hungry ghosts, the beings who have died and find themselves in a state of continued craving and continued suffering. We are going to explore a question that the tradition takes seriously with great tenderness. What happens to what we offer when we offer it across the boundary of death? Do the dead receive? This is a story about memory, and about how love does not stop at the edge of a life, and about the gifts that pass between worlds when we remember honestly and completely the people who are no longer here. In the cosmology of the Pali Buddhist tradition, death is not a wall. It is more like a doorway in a house with many rooms, one room ending, another beginning, with the quality of what has been lived and chosen and cultivated in one room having a great deal to do with the character of the room you step into next. The beings called Pitas, sometimes translated as hungry ghosts, though the Pali word just means departed ones, are described as existing in a state of intense, frustrated craving. They are the beings who lived in such a way that craving and grasping dominated their inner lives, and who find themselves in the next life experiencing that domination in an amplified form. The images in the Petavathu, the stories of the departed ones, one of the texts of the Pali Canon, are vivid and not always comfortable. Beings with enormous mouths and tiny, needle-like throats, unable to swallow the very thing they most desperately crave. Beings surrounded by food that turns to ash when they touch it. Beings tormented by hunger and thirst in the midst of apparent abundance. These images are not primarily meant as cosmological description. Within the tradition's framework, they are taken seriously as such. They are also, and perhaps more importantly, map of a very particular kind of human suffering that does not require a literal afterlife to be completely recognizable. The person who has everything they wanted and cannot enjoy it. A person for whom acquisition is never followed by satisfaction, only by the intensification of the desire for more. The person who eats and is never nourished. You have seen this. You may, at certain points in your own life, have felt some version of it. The Petavathu contains a story that I want to tell you now because it speaks to something that most people, across most of human history, have wanted to believe, that the people we have lost are not entirely beyond the reach of our love, that something of what we feel for them, something of what we do in their memory and in their honor, and finds its way across the distance of death and reaches them. The story begins in the city of Rajagaha, where a king named Bimbisara was ruling with the Buddha as his most respected guest and teacher. Bimbisara was a devoted lay follower, perhaps the most politically powerful one in the early Sangha's history, and he organized one day an elaborate feast and offering for the monks. Food was prepared in great quantities. The halls of the palace were opened. The entire Sangha in the area was invited. The feast was magnificent. That night the king was disturbed by sounds, wailing, keening, a kind of anguished crying coming from somewhere near the palace. It was not the ordinary sounds of the city. It was something more desperate, more raw, more hungry. And he went to the Buddha the next morning and described what he had heard. The Buddha told him what the sounds were. They were the cries of beings, Petas, who were relatives of the king from previous lives, and they had seen the great feast being prepared, had hoped it would be offered in their memory so that they could share in the merit of the gift. And when no dedication of merit was made to them, they were left standing at the edge of the feast with their enormous mouths and their needle throats, unable to eat, unable to receive, crying in the night outside the palace walls. "What should I do?" Bimbisara asked. "Give again," the Buddha said. And this time, when you give, dedicate the merit. Say clearly, this gift is offered for the benefit of all beings, including those who have gone before, who were connected to me in this life and in lives previous. Whatever good arises from this giving, may they receive it. May they rejoice in it. Bimbisara organized another feast. He offered the food and the cloth and the generosity that he had offered before, and at the moment of the offering he dedicated the merit with the formula the Buddha had given him. The texts record what happened next with characteristic precision. The Pitas, the departed relatives, saw the offering. They understood that it was given in part for them, and they responded with what the Pali calls anumodana. Rejoicing, resonating with joy, the particular pleasure of witnessing generosity and being able to appreciate it. And in that rejoicing, in the act of opening to the merit being offered to them, of accepting the gift being given across the distance of death, their condition improved. The needle throats opened. The craving that had defined their existence softened even slightly, even temporarily. They received. This teaching has been criticized from various quarters as superstition, as a holdover from pre-Buddhist ancestor worship traditions that the early Sangha was unable or unwilling to fully abandon. And perhaps there is something in that criticism worth hearing. Perhaps the literal cosmology of the Pita realm is not the point, any more than the literal flying of Mara's army of demons over the Bodhi tree is the point. The point, or one of the points, is this. The love we feel for those who have died does not automatically conclude with the death. It continues, it needs somewhere to go. And the practice of making offerings in memory of the dead, of dedicating acts of generosity to those who are gone, of saying their names in the context of something good being done in the world. This is not superstition. This is the management of grief. This is the recognition that love which has nowhere to go is love that turns into ache. And love that is given a direction and a practice becomes something that nourishes both the living and, not in whatever way the tradition's cosmology describes, the dead. The Pali word for dedicating merit to the departed is patadana, gift of sharing. The extending of the positive qualities of an action beyond the immediate transaction to reach beings who were not physically present in the giving. It is practiced in Buddhist communities across Asia to this day, at every major festival and at the anniversaries of deaths and at the simple daily meal times in monasteries where monks chant a dedication to all beings before they eat. Who is it for? Is it for the dead? Who receive some actual benefit from the thought and the gesture? Is it for the living, who need a way to hold their grief and their love together in a single practice? Is it for the community, which is strengthened by the regular, elective acknowledgement that we are connected not only to each other in the present, but to all the lives that have preceded ours? Perhaps the most honest answer is yes, all of those. It does not have to be only one thing. There is a person, or perhaps more than one, who you carry in your heart. Someone who is gone, someone whose absence has a shape in your life that has not filled in, that perhaps never will entirely fill in, because the person who occupied that space was genuinely irreplaceable and the space knows it. You do not need to resolve anything about them tonight. You do not need to reach a conclusion or make peace or achieve any particular emotional state. But if there is something, a thought, a breath, a simple silent acknowledgement of their name in the quiet of this night, that wants to be offered, you can offer it now. Just that, just the thought, just the name, just the breath that says, I remember you. Whatever I am doing that is good, whatever care I am bringing to my own life and to the lives of the people around me, some of it is yours, some of it is for you. The Petas heard the dedication and rejoiced. Ache in them softened. The needle throats opened just enough. Perhaps there is a version of this that is available to all of us on both sides of the distance. Perhaps love given with genuine intention finds its way through walls that we believed were solid. Perhaps the dead receive what we send to them, in whatever way receiving means for beings who are no longer here. Or perhaps the receiving is ours. Perhaps what shifts when we make the offering is something in us, the place where the grief has been sitting alone, not knowing it was allowed to be part of the larger flow of giving and receiving that is the whole of life. Perhaps the needle throat that opens is our own. Rest in that for now. The night is going to carry you forward gently into the next story. A story from a very long time ago, from a life that the tradition says preceded the life of Siddhartha Gautama by many thousands of years, in the vast chain of lives that the Buddhist understanding calls samsara. And a story about someone who gave not a lamp, not a meal, not a teaching, but something so intimate and so impossible that even telling it requires a moment of preparation. He gave his eyes, and the reason he gave them, and what the giving cost him, and what it produced in the world, that is the next thing the night has to tell you. Breathe. The stories are moving through you like water. You are resting. You are safe. The dark around you is the soft dark of the deep night, holding you the way the earth holds everything that grows in it, completely, without condition, without any requirement that you be different from exactly what you are. Now close your eyes a little more. The story is already on its way. The Bodhisattva who gave his eyes long before the man who would become the Buddha was born as Siddhartha Gautama in the foothills of the Himalayan range, the kingdom of the Shakyas, in the household of Suddhodana. Long before all of that, the tradition says, the being who would eventually become the Buddha was practicing, moving through life after life, each one an education, each one a deepening of the qualities that would eventually make awakening possible. The Jataka tales, 547 stories, gathered in the Pali canon, each one presenting a previous life of the being the tradition calls the Bodhisattva, the awakening being, are some of the oldest and most beloved literature in all of Buddhist history. They were told in monasteries and at festivals, and to children at bedtime in stone carvings on temple walls across India and Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, in paintings and sculptures and dramatic performances that have been staged continuously, in one form or another, for more than 2,000 years. They are not in the main realistic stories. They are the stories of a being in process, someone working towards something across many lives and many forms, practicing the perfections that would eventually flower into awakening. And the perfection that the Jataka we are going to enter tonight is concerned with is the perfection of dana, of generosity. And the form it takes is one that the rational mind immediately resists and the heart immediately understands. In one of his previous lives, the tradition says, the Bodhisattva was a king, a wise king, a generous king, one who had made the practice of dana the center of his royal life in the same way that Pasenadi had attempted to, but with a completeness and a freedom from the watching that Pasenadi was still working toward. This king gave readily, freely, without tracking what the giving cost him, because the practice of dana had moved in him from an activity to a quality of being. He did not do generosity, he was generous. A way the sun is warm, not because it decides to be, but because warmth is what it is made of. He gave food to the hungry, land to the landless, medicine to the sick, protection to the frightened. He gave from the royal treasury, and when the treasury ran low, he gave from the palace itself, furniture, tapestries, the horses from the royal stables. His advisors grew increasingly alarmed. His treasury ministers wrote increasingly urgent memos, and the king continued to give. Word of the king's generosity spread, as word of extraordinary things tends to do in both ancient stories and the actual world, into unexpected places. And in a distant part of the kingdom, there was a man who was blind, a scholar, some versions say, a man of learning and intelligence who had lost his sight and who had been told by someone that somewhere there was a king who would give anything to anyone who asked. He came, a long journey, made difficult by the blindness, made worthwhile by the strength of his need. He was brought before the king. He explained what he wanted, he needed eyes. He was blind. He had heard that the king gave everything. Would the king give him his eyes? There is a silence in the story at this point that the texts preserve carefully. Not a dramatic pause for effect, a silence of the king actually considering the question. actually holding it, actually weighing what was being asked of him and what the asking meant. He could refuse, he could give gold instead, or land, or a guide to help the blind man navigate a life without sight. He could explain very reasonably that there are limits to what can be given, that certain gifts are impossible, that the body itself cannot be offered the way cloth or food can be offered, that no tradition of generosity requires its practitioner to give what cannot be replaced. He could do all of that. He said yes, and what follows in the Jajaka is described with a restraint that makes it more, rather than less affecting. The king gave his right eye first and then his left eye, and the blind man received them, and with a reverence that the texts mark as genuine and not merely decorative, he was able somehow to use them. He could see. He left the presence of the king with sight restored, moving through a world that had returned to him its full dimension and color and light, and the king sat in the dark. The texts do not tell us he did not suffer. They do not suggest that the perfection of dana requires the absence of pain, the absence of grief, the absence of all the very human feelings that accompany an act of radical self-giving. And the king sat in the darkness that was now his permanent condition, and the texts say simply that he did not regret what he had done, not because he had not counted the cost, but because, when he counted it fully, weighed everything he had given against everything the giving had been for, he found that the weight on the side of the giving was greater, not in a calculated way, not in the way of someone who has run the numbers and found they come out positive, a way of someone who has given from the deepest place in themselves and found that the deepest place in themselves does not deal in numbers at all. The god Indra, the divine being who in the Hindu and early Buddhist cosmological framework presides over the heavens, is said to have come to the king in this moment. He had been watching the way the divine beings in these stories are always watching the exceptional moments of the world with a mixture of wonder and the particular desire to intervene that is the divine equivalent of the human impulse to help. Why? Indra asked. Why did you do it? What did you gain? Nothing, the king said. And everything. I am practicing the perfection of giving, not giving until it hurts. Giving past the hurt, into the place where what is given and what is kept are no longer two different things. Indra, moved by what he witnessed, or perhaps moved by the philosophical cleanliness of the answer, restored the king's sight. The texts describe the eyes that returned as brighter and clearer than the ones that had been given away, able to see further and more truly. The divine eyes, some versions call them, which can see not just the surface of things, but the nature of things. Now, I want to be honest with you about this story. On one level, it is a mythological story. It belongs to a genre of literature that uses extremity to make a point, the way fables use talking animals to make a point. Not because the story is meant to be taken as a literal account of events known, but because the extremity clarifies something that more moderate examples might leave ambiguous. The point the Bodhisattva King story is making about dana cannot be made with the story of someone who gives an extra coat, or even someone who donates a significant portion of their income to people in need. Those are genuinely good stories about genuinely good things, but they do not illuminate the absolute horizon of the practice. I do not ask the question, is there any limit? Is there anything that cannot, in principle, be offered? The Jataka answers no. But it answers this with something very important attached, the freedom from regret. The Bodhisattva does not give his eyes in anguish and suffer through it as an act of noble martyrdom. He gives them with, the Pali word the tradition uses is pasada, a quality of clarity and serenity, a settled luminosity of spirit that is the opposite of the tight-gripped performance of sacrifice. He gives as someone gives who has thoroughly understood what giving is. This is the distinction the whole night of stories has been circling, from the first moment in the grove with Akkosa, through Kisa Gotami's open hands, through Pasenadi's watching and Puna's wide field and Nanda's single lamp. It is not the quantity of the gift that determines its nature. It is the quality of the hand that offers it, the tightness or openness of the grip, the presence or absence of the watching, the degree to which the giving flows from a place of genuine freedom rather than from a place of grasping for the identity of the one who gives. You do not need to give your eyes tonight, none. You are not being asked to give anything at all. The stories are not instructions, they are lanterns, held up to illuminate something that is already in you, already there, perhaps obscured by the ordinary business of a life lived in the middle of its own concerns, but there, the impulse towards generosity that does not need anything back. The moment of genuine giving that you have experienced, perhaps many times without naming it as such, when you gave time or attention or care or honesty to someone who needed it, without counting the cost, without tracking the return, without the watching. You have been that person. No, perhaps more than you know. The Bodhisattva king sat in the darkness after giving his eyes away, and he did not regret. The night around him was complete and soft and full, the way this night is complete and soft and full around you now. The darkness was not an absence, it was a presence. The presence of a mind that had given everything and found that everything was still, somehow, here. Let your breath be easy. Let the stories settle into the deeper layers of your rest. We are moving now into the final act of this night. 2 chapters remain, the largest and the most essential. We are going back to the Bodhi tree, not to a different night at the Bodhi tree. Not the night of awakening, but the night of the last temptation. The night Mara came not with armies or daughters, but with something far more dangerous than either of those. Something that looked, from the outside, exactly like everything the Buddha had ever wanted. And after that, we are going to the last meal, the gift that ended a life and changed the world. The thing that Cunda the smith offered and the Buddha accepted, and why that acceptance, more than any refusal, is the deepest teaching this night has to offer. The night is holding you. The breath is slow. The stories know the way. Night. Mara came with everything. There is a second night. Most people know the first. The night beside the Niranjana river. The Bodhi tree, the awakening. That story is the one the tradition has carried most visibly. The one carved on the walls of 10,000 temples. The one spoken at the opening of teachings and written in the first chapter of books about the Buddha's life. It is the night that changed everything. But there is a second night that the tradition speaks of less often, and it matters, perhaps just as much, perhaps in a different way, because it happened not at the beginning of the Buddha's path, but at a very different moment. A moment when the man beneath the tree was not a searching prince, but the teacher 40 years into his ministry, with hundreds of thousands of followers across the Ganges plain and a reputation that had spread to the edges of the known world. Mara came again. The story appears in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the great discourse on the Buddha's final passing, one of the longest and most carefully constructed texts in the entire Pali Canon. A document that the tradition clearly regarded as requiring extraordinary care in the telling. It is a text about endings, about the final weeks and months of the Buddha's physical life, not about the conversations and teachings and moments of the last journey. And in the middle of that text, Mara appears. He comes to the Buddha at a place called Kapala Shrine, near the city of Vesali, a late afternoon of golden light. The setting is significant. Vesali was a beautiful city, one of the great republican cities of the ancient Ganges plain, a place of culture and learning and prosperous households, and surrounded by gardens and parks and the broad, slow rivers of the northern plain. It was by any account a pleasant place to be. Mara's opening is not fire or armies or tempting daughters. He comes, this time, with something altogether more dangerous. He comes with reasonableness. Lord, he says, and the address is itself significant, respectful, none of the contempt of the first encounter. You have accomplished what you set out to accomplish. You have taught for 40 years. The teaching is established. The Sangha is established. Kings and queens and merchants and farmers and monks and nuns and wanderers from 100 different traditions have heard the Dhamma and been transformed by it. The wheel is turning. It cannot be stopped now, even if you were to stop speaking. The Buddha listened. It is time, Mara said, to let go, to release the body. You have done what you came to do. There is no need to continue carrying this physical existence any further. Enter final nibbana now. Your work is complete. And here is the thing that makes this moment so much more complex than the first encounter with Mara, so many years before at the Bodhi tree. Because what Mara was saying was not, on its surface, false. The teaching was established. The Sangha was enormous, spread across kingdoms, sustained by people who had understood and who would carry it forward without the physical presence of the founder. The Buddha's body was, by this point in his life, genuinely worn. He was 80 years old, by the traditional reckoning, his health declining, the long decades of wandering and teaching having done what long decades of wandering and teaching do to a human body. And nibbana, the final cessation, a complete release from the cycle of conditioned existence, was not something the tradition feared or mourned. It was, in the deepest understanding of the Dhamma, the goal. The point toward which all the practice pointed, Mara, was offering the Buddha the thing that is most central to the Buddha's own teaching, and offering it now, before its time, for reasons that were not what they appeared to be. The Buddha saw this. He had, after 40 years of teaching the nature of the mind, an extraordinarily refined capacity for seeing through the surface of what was offered to the thing underneath it, And what was underneath Mara's reasonable invitation was not compassion for a tired old teacher, but the ancient anxiety of the Lord of the realm of death and desire. The anxiety that the wheel, once fully turning, it would eventually turn everyone out of that realm entirely. That awakening, spreading through the world, would ultimately empty the territory that Mara governed. Mara wanted the wheel stopped, and the most elegant way to stop the wheel was not opposition. Opposition had failed, twice most visibly. The most elegant way was to offer the driver of the wheel the destination as an early exit, to say, "You can have what you want right now, just put down the wheel." The Buddha's response was, in its own way, as calm and as simple as his response to Akkosa in the Jetavana Grove. "Not yet, Mara," he said. "Not, never. Not, this is a trap, and I see through it. Not an argument about the nature of nibbana or the state of the Sangha or the appropriateness of the timing, just not yet." And then, and this is the part that I find most moving, most human, most revelatory of the character the tradition has preserved across all these centuries, the Buddha told Mara what the condition would need to be. When would it be time? When I have monks and nuns, laymen and laywomen, who are trained and disciplined and confident and learned and have memorized the Dhamma, when they are able to teach it and explain it and establish it and reveal it and proclaim and recite it clearly, and when, having done this, they are able by means of the Dhamma to refute opposing doctrines that arise. When all of this is the case, Mara, then it will be time. In other words, when I am sure the gift will be received, when I am sure it has been received deeply enough to be carried forward, when the thing I came to offer has been fully taken into the hands of the people it was offered to, only then. This is perhaps the most extraordinary thing in this entire night of extraordinary things. The Buddha, confronted with the offer of the thing his own teaching points toward as the highest good, confronted with a completely reasonable case for release from the burdens of physical existence, delayed his own final liberation in order to make sure the gift was truly given, not partially, not provisionally, fully, the point where it could exist without him. He was holding the gift open long enough for everyone to receive it. Mara went away. The texts say he was dejected. a word that applies with an almost comic appropriateness to the Lord of Death and Desire who had just failed for the third time to tempt the Buddha into any version of the taking that Mara specialized in. He went away, and the Buddha sat for a while in the evening light of Vesali, watching the last sun on the Veranda River, the garden trees going golden and then dark, the city settling into its evening sounds. I want to stay in this moment a little longer before we follow the Buddha down the road to Kusinara, and because there is something in the quality of this second refusal of Mara that is different from the first. Different in a way that matters for anyone who is somewhere in the middle of their own life, known past the beginning but not yet at the end. The refusal at the Bodhi tree was the refusal of a seeker, someone who had not yet found what he was looking for, who knew that the thing being offered in Mara's gifts, comfort, pleasure, the return to ordinary life, was genuine but not sufficient. Not wrong, exactly, just not what he had come for. The refusal there was the refusal of incompleteness. I cannot stop here because I have not yet arrived anywhere. And the refusal at the Kapala shrine was something else entirely. It was the refusal of someone who has arrived, who has, in fact, been standing in the place he was looking for 45 years, and who is choosing, with full knowledge of what he is choosing, to remain available, to stay in the doorway a little longer, to hold the door open. This is a distinction the tradition makes quietly but consistently. There is a difference between the liberation that the Buddha attained at the Bodhi tree, what the texts call Samasambodhi, complete and perfect awakening, and the final nibbana that Mara was inviting him toward at Vesali. First is the liberation of understanding. The mind sees clearly what is, has always been, and can never be otherwise. The second is the liberation of the body's release, the ending of this particular physical manifestation, return of these particular elements to the elements. The Buddha had the first. He was not yet ready to accept the second. And the reason he was not ready was the reason he had said out loud to Mara, because the gift was still being given, because there were still people with dust in their eyes who would benefit from hearing it, because the wheel, once set in motion, requires the continued, embodied, walking and sitting and speaking presence of someone who knows the way it turns, at least until enough other people know it too. This is a teaching about the nature of genuine service that has very little to do with monks and their lifetimes of dedication, and quite a lot to do with anyone who has ever had something real to offer and had to decide when to keep offering it and when to finally, gracefully set it down. There are people who hold on to their gifts past the point of usefulness, past the point where the holding is about service and has become about their own need to be needed, to be central, to be the one that the situation cannot proceed without. The tradition recognizes this. It is a form of the same grasping that it identifies everywhere else and releasing it, stepping back from the role, passing the teaching to the students, letting the next generation carry what you have carried, requires the same open-handedness that all the other forms of release require. And there are people who release too soon, and who let go of what they carry before the ones who need it have had enough time to receive it fully, who accept too readily an offer of rest, not from genuine completeness but from exhaustion or discouragement, or the quiet voice that says what you have to offer is probably not worth the effort of continuing to offer it. Mara's invitation was, in this sense, a test of something more subtle than temptation by pleasure. It was a test of whether the Buddha could distinguish between genuine completion and the desire for rest dressed up as completion. It was a test of whether the open hand knew the difference between freely giving and giving up. He did. Not yet, Mara. 3 more months of walking in a body that was 80 years old and increasingly reluctant. 3 more months of teaching. 3 more months of the door held open. And then, fully, freely, at the right time, the release. He sat there for 3 months. 3 months of continuing to teach, continuing to walk, continuing to be present to the people who came with their questions and their grief and their confusion and their occasional, unexpected, luminous moments of understanding. 3 months of the gift still held open, and then at a place called Kusinara, a small, not particularly distinguished city in the Mala Republic, a place the Buddha's attendant Ananda found disappointingly unimpressive for the location of such a significant event, the time came. But before it came, there was one more meal, and the story of that meal is the story we have been moving toward all night. His name was Cunda, and he was a metalsmith, what the Pali calls a kamara, a worker in metal, a craftsman who shaped hard things in fire. He lived in the city of Pava, which lay on the road between Vesali and Kusinara, and he had heard, as the whole region had heard by now, that the Buddha was making his final journey. He went to the Buddha and offered what he had. He invited the Buddha and the assembled monks to a meal at his home. This was a common practice in that time and place. Lay people offered meals to wandering monks as a form of generosity, of dana, and the tradition considered such offerings to generate significant merit for the giver. Now, Kunda's invitation was accepted, and the next morning the Buddha arrived at his home with his attendants. Cunda had prepared food carefully, and among the dishes he offered was one whose nature has been debated by scholars and commentators for more than 2,000 years. The Pali word for it is sukaramadava. It has been translated at various times as a preparation involving pork, or as a mushroom dish, or as a type of soft rice, or as a preparation made from something that pigs are known to eat. The debate has never been fully resolved, and it is perhaps not meant to be. The text seems less interested in the exact botanical or culinary identity of the dish than in what happened after it was eaten. What happened was that the Buddha, after eating, became severely ill. The texts describe it as an acute, painful illness, the kind of illness that makes very clear to everyone present that something serious is happening. His attendant Ananda was deeply alarmed. The monks around him were alarmed, and the Buddha, who had, after all, just a few months before told Mara that the time was not yet, that the gift needed to be fully given before he would release the body. The Buddha asked for the sukaramadava to not be served to the other monks. He received the dish himself, alone. There are different ways to understand this. One is that the Buddha recognized that the food was contaminated or harmful and protected his monks from eating it while being unable to refuse it entirely, because the refusal would have shamed Cunda and caused him tremendous suffering. Another is that the Buddha recognized in this meal the instrument of the death he had known was approaching and accepted it with full awareness, turned toward it rather than away from it, received what was being offered not as something to be survived but as something to be completed. The second understanding is the one that speaks most directly to everything we have been exploring tonight, because here, at the end of a life that had been defined by the discipline of what to receive and what to refuse, at the end of a night of stories about the burning coal and the refused anger and the mustard seed and the widow's lamp and the man who could not be caught, here, at the very last, the Buddha received. He received what was offered with full knowledge of what it would cost him, and then he walked. Despite the severity of the illness, the Buddha insisted on continuing to Kusinara, and he walked with Ananda beside him, stopping frequently to rest, stopping at one point to lie down beneath a tree because the pain was very great, stopping at a stream called Kakutha to drink and bathe, and then continuing. And each stop is recorded in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, with the precision of people who understood that they were witnessing something they needed to remember exactly. At one of these rest stops, by the road in the heat of the afternoon, something happened that I want to tell you carefully because it is one of the most tender moments in the entire account. Ananda, who had been with the Buddha for 25 years, who had served him as his personal attendant, who had memorized more of the Buddha's teachings than any other monk in the Sangha, who was known throughout the tradition as the beloved disciple, Ananda began to weep. He did not weep in front of the Buddha. He stepped away and leaned against a building nearby and wept. The Buddha noticed his absence. He asked where Ananda was, and someone said he had gone aside to weep. and the Buddha asked that Ananda be brought back to him. And when Ananda returned, his face still carrying the evidence of what had been happening, the Buddha spoke to him with the same directness and the same compassion that he had brought to every conversation of his teaching life. Do not grieve, Ananda, not be distressed. Have I not repeatedly told you that it is the nature of all things dear and beloved to us that we become separated from them? Everything that arises passes. Everything that is born must die. How could it be otherwise with this body? It has existed long enough. Enough, Ananda. Do not grieve. Then, something that cuts through all the doctrine and all the philosophy and all the carefully constructed architecture of the teaching, and arrives at something simply, nakedly true. For a long time, Ananda, you have served the Tathagata with an act of love in deed and word and thought, helpfully, pleasantly, with undivided heart. You have done well, Ananda. Keep working. You will soon be free. You will soon be free. Not teaching is what matters. Not you must not be attached to persons. Not the instruction that you might expect from a teacher whose central message is the liberation from clinging. Not, but the acknowledgement from a dying man to the person who had been most present with him across most of a lifetime, that what you have given matters, that the love has been seen, that the service has been received. The Buddha received Ananda's love, plainly, clearly, directly, received it and named it and held it for a moment in the light before letting it, and everything else, go. They arrived at Kusinara. The Buddha asked Ananda to prepare a resting place between two sal trees, twin trees of the species Shorea robusta, whose creamy flowers were, at that moment, just coming into bloom. The trees were flowering out of season, which the texts note with the attention they always give to the way the natural world responds to the extraordinary moments of those who live in it. The flowers fell on the Buddha as he lay down, and the texts describe a rain of coral blossoms settling over the body of the dying teacher, the way snow settles, without intent, without meaning, simply falling because it was their nature to fall. And it was the nature of the moment to receive them. The monks gathered. Word had spread, as word of these things always spreads faster than seems possible. Through the community, through the city, through the region, people came. Lay followers and monks and nuns and wanderers from other traditions who had known the Buddha or heard of him or simply sensed that something singular was ending. A Mala chieftain named Pukusa came and offered the Buddha a robe of gold, and the Buddha accepted it, and then, noting that it had lost its luster against the luminosity of the dying man's skin, smiled at the observation and let even that small vanity of the moment pass. A wandering ascetic named Subhada came, an old man, himself near the end of his life, who had been wanting to ask the Buddha a question for years and had never managed to find the right moment. Ananda, protective of his teacher in these last hours, tried to send Subhada away. The Buddha heard and overruled Ananda. He received Subhada. He answered his question. Subhada became, the texts say, the last person to attain ordination directly from the Buddha himself. The gift was still being offered from the resting place between the sal trees, the last hours before dawn. And then the Buddha spoke to the assembled monks for the last time. He had given many thousands of teachings. He had spoken across 45 years of ministry to kings and farmers and merchants and ascetics and Brahmins and outcasts and scholars and the simply lost and the genuinely searching. He had found the right words again and again, and for the bewildering variety of human beings who had come to him with the bewildering variety of human predicaments. He had spoken about suffering and its origins and its cessation and the path. He had spoken about impermanence and non-self and the constructed nature of what we take to be a fixed identity. He had spoken about kindness and compassion and equanimity and the joy that arises from genuine practice. Now, at the very end, what did he say? The words that the tradition has carried from that moment in the Pala are among the most famous in the entire Buddhist canon. Vayadhamma Sankara Apamadina Sampadetha. All conditioned things are impermanent. Work out your liberation with diligence. That is the whole of the last teaching. Nothing new, nothing that had not been said 1,000 times before, in 1,000 different ways, across 45 years of wandering and sitting and speaking in the morning light of 1,000 different groves and courtyards and palace gardens. Just the two truths, placed side by side in the last moment of the voice that had carried them for half a century. Everything changes. Keep going. And then the Buddha entered into a sequence of meditative states, moving through the levels of absorption one by one, and ascending and descending through the stages of stillness in a pattern that his monks recognized from a lifetime of watching him practice. And then, from the final stillness, the breath simply stopped. The sal trees continued to rain their flowers. Ananda wept, this time without restraint. And somewhere in the very large silence that followed, a question that has been threading through this entire night, through Akkosa and the Bodhi tree and Kisa Gotami and Pasenadi and Punna and Angulimala and the widow's lamp and the hungry ghosts and the Bodhisattva king and the garden of Vesali where Mara came a second time, that question finally found its fullest answer. And the question was, what does it mean to leave a gift where it is placed? And the answer, arrived at through the whole long arc of the night, through all the stories and all the characters and all the different forms that giving and refusing and receiving have taken, is this. The Buddha refused anger and found that it dissolved, and he refused Mara's armies and found that fear had no purchase. He refused the crown at the Bodhi tree and found that wanting the crown had been the only thing preventing him from receiving something far greater. He refused Mara's reasonable invitation at Vesali and found 3 more months of the gift still being given. And then, at the very end, at the end of everything, at the meal that Cunda set before him, he received the meal. He received the illness the meal brought. He received the death the illness brought. He received Ananda's grief and met it with love. He received Subhada's late question and answered it fully. He received the falling flowers of the sal trees and let them settle on him without brushing them away. He received the meal. He received the illness the meal brought. He received the death the illness brought. He received Nanda's grief and met it with love. He received Subhada's late question and answered it fully. He received the falling flowers of the sal trees and let them settle on him without brushing them away. He received at the end everything that was offered, because he had by that point nothing left to protect, no self that needed defending against what was coming, no story about the kind of person he was that required maintenance or demonstration, no grip on life itself that needed to be unclenched. There is something I need to tell you about Cunda. And after the Buddha died, in the days immediately following, as the Mala people of Kusinara were preparing for the funeral rites, as monks and lay people from across the region were converging on this small, undistinguished city to be present at the ending of something that would not end again, Ananda went to Cunda, not with blame. Ananda had loved the Buddha with the wholeness of 25 years of daily, constant, devoted presence, and he was in the full flood of his grief, and there would have been something very understandable, very human, about directing some of that grief toward the man whose meal had been the vehicle of the final illness. But the tradition records that what Ananda brought to Cunda was the opposite of blame. He brought the Buddha's own words, which the Buddha had spoken before the illness deepened, knowing they would be needed. He had said, El Cunda, that there are 2 meals which are of equal merit, of equal fruit, more fruitful and beneficial than any other. And the first is the meal offered to a Tathagata just before his final awakening, the bowl of rice porridge that Sujata offered the starving ascetic on the bank of the Niranjana River all those years ago, a meal that restored enough strength for the night under the Bodhi tree. And the second is the meal offered to a Tathagata just before his parinibbana. These 2 meals stand at the threshold of the 2 most significant moments in the Buddha's existence. The first on the threshold of awakening, the second on the threshold of the final release. And the Buddha in his last days, knowing what was coming, and knowing that Cunda would need to live with it, ensured that the man who offered the last meal knew that he had not caused a death, but marked a completion. Cunda received this message and wept. And not from guilt, the texts suggest, or not only from guilt, but from the particular quality of feeling that arises when you understand that what you did mattered more than you knew, in ways you could not have anticipated. That the person who received what you offered received it with full awareness and with gratitude. He had offered a meal. The Buddha had accepted it with open hands, and between that offering and that acceptance, a life of extraordinary purpose had moved in the most natural and unremarkable of ways into its completion. This is the symmetry at the heart of the whole night's teaching, and I want to name it clearly before the stories go quiet. At the beginning, the Buddha refused what was offered in anger. He left Akkosa's gift of contempt where it was placed, unpicked, returning to the giver by the simple logic of an unclosed hand. At the end, he accepted what was offered in love. He took Kunda's meal, and Ananda's grief and Subhada's question, and the flowers of the sal trees into himself completely, without reservation, without the protection that a lesser kind of equanimity might have maintained between the dying man and the very large fact of his own dying. In the beginning, the refusal of harm, cleanly and without drama. At the end, the acceptance of everything cleanly and without drama. And between those two moments, 45 years of the open hand, 45 years of offering what had been found to whoever came and was ready to receive it, in whatever form they were able to receive it in. 45 years of meeting people in their anger and their grief and their pride and their confusion and their occasional precious and arriving at last moments of genuine understanding and finding the exact right way to offer exactly what they needed at exactly the moment they could hear it. This is what the tradition means by the phrase that appears again and again in descriptions of the Buddha's way of teaching. Yathabukam, according to what is real, in accordance with what is actually the case, and the gift given in accordance with reality, not with what the giver wants to give, or what the giver thinks the receiver needs, or what is most impressive or most comprehensive or most philosophically rigorous. With what is real, in this moment, for this person, in this place. That is a rare and difficult art. It requires the emptying of the self to the point where the needs of the person in front of you are more visible than your own agenda for them. It requires the kind of attention that is only available when you have stopped monitoring your own performance closely enough to actually see another person. The Buddha practiced this for 45 years, and he lay down between the flowering trees and stopped the open hand all the way to the end, and what he left, the teaching, the Dhamma, the thing that had moved from him to Nanda, and from Nanda to the tradition, and from the tradition to the monks and nuns and scholars and practitioners and grandmothers whispering to children in the dark, all the way to this moment, on, to this night, to the words that are moving through you now as you rest. He gave something away on a night beside a river more than 2,500 years ago, and it is still moving through the world now, still arriving at bedsides and riversides and morning groves and the quiet rooms where people lie down in the dark and let themselves be still for a while. This is what a gift looks like when it is truly given, not the gold or the cloth or even the teaching in its precise technical formulations. The gift is the quality that animates all of it, the genuine, undefended, unprotected openness of a being who has nothing to prove and nothing to protect, and is therefore free to offer everything, receive everything, and ultimately release everything with a grace that the sal trees honored by blooming out of season in the middle of the night. We began this night with a burning coal. A man named Akkosa came to a grove with a gift of anger. A teacher declined to receive it. The coal stayed in the giver's hands, and in the staying something shifted, something that, across 45 years of continuing to offer the teaching, across thousands of similar moments with thousands of different people arriving with their 1,000 different versions of the burning coal, the teacher never stopped practicing. He never stopped declining to pick up what was offered in anger. He never stopped receiving what was offered in love. He never confused the two. And in the space that this clarity created, in the wide open, undefended field of a mind that had learned to leave harm where it was placed and receive kindness fully and completely, the teaching lived and breathed and moved through the world. It is moving through you now. You do not have to do anything with it. You do not have to remember the names or the dates or the specific turns of the stories. You do not have to become a different person by morning, or have an insight, or make a resolution. The stories have been doing their work in the places that are deeper than intention and faster than thought. The roots are going down in the dark the way roots always do, quietly, without announcement, without any requirement that you observe the process. Rest now. The teaching has been given. The fire has been burning in the dark beside you for the length of this whole long night. You do not need to pick up the coal, never did. And yet, before I let you go entirely into the dark, I want to say one more thing about Akkosa, because he is the one who started this night, and it seems right that he be the one to close it. And he went home that morning from the Jetavana Grove, you will remember, carrying the unanswered echo of his own voice. He had come with words designed to wound, and the words had stayed with him. He had walked home in the strange disorientation of a man whose most reliable tool had suddenly stopped working. He became, in the months and years that followed, an upasaka, a lay follower. Not a monk, not someone who gave up his household or his land or the Brahmin robes that were his inheritance and his identity. Just a man who had encountered something he had not expected to encounter and who had chosen to continue encountering it. To go back, to listen, to practice imperfectly and inconsistently, the beginning again that the Buddha had described. He wrote to his brother wrote back. Something that had been sealed reopened. The texts do not tell us he became enlightened. No, they do not tell us that he gave away his possessions or shaved his head or achieved anything that the tradition marks with its honorific terms of spiritual attainment. They tell us, essentially, almost nothing more. And he appears in the Akkosa Sutta in those vivid minutes of morning confrontation and the quiet that followed, and then he returns to the anonymity of the ordinary life. And I think this is exactly right. And because Akkosa is not a story about transformation as spectacle, he is a story about transformation as the very slow, very ordinary, very unglamorous process of becoming slightly less defended one morning at a time, of writing one difficult letter, of going back to a place that humbled you and choosing to listen rather than to argue, of noticing when the anger comes that you are holding something hot and pausing just long enough to choose not to reach for it. This is the version of the teaching that is available to everyone in this room, in every room where these words have found their way in the dark, not the version that requires 45 years of wandering ministry and the complete dissolution of the ego self and the ability to sit unmoved while armies of demon spirits assault you in the night. A version that requires one breath, taken slowly, before you reach for the burning coal. You can do that. You already know how to do that. You are doing it right now. Every night that you lie down in the dark and let the breath slow and the muscles soften and the grip of the thinking mind gradually loosen. Every one of those nights is a practice of the same fundamental thing, the same release, the same trust in something that holds you without your management of it. The same willingness to receive the night and let it do its work in you without interference. The gift of sleep is not so different from the gift the Buddha received at the end beneath the sal trees, the giving over, the open hand, the trust that what comes after the release is not emptiness but something that cannot be named from inside the grasping and is only available on the other side of the letting go. You are letting go right now. In the slow breath, the softening body in the quiet that is growing quieter around you. You are doing the most important thing. You are practicing the thing that all the stories have been practicing alongside you. Release, rest, receive. Night is yours. We are going to close now the way the tradition closes its teachings, not with a summary, not with a list of takeaways, but with a return. A return to the body, to the breath, to the simple fact of being here, in the dark held by the night. Let your attention move slowly, gently, through the body. Start at the top of the head. Just notice the top of the head, not thinking about it, none. Just letting the awareness rest there the way a hand rests on something warm. Notice if there is any tension there, in the scalp, in the forehead, around the eyes, and let it soften, not forcing, not commanding the tension away, none. Just making room for it to release, the way you make room for something by opening your hand rather than unclenching it. Let the awareness move down. The jaw. The jaw holds so much, the things left unsaid, the things said too sharply, the grinding pressure of all the days that ask more of us than we have. Let the jaw loosen, let the teeth part, just slightly. Let the tongue fall away from the roof of the mouth. Let the throat be soft. The shoulders. The shoulders carry the weight of what we believe is ours to carry. The responsibilities, the worries, the long lists of things that have not been done, and the longer lists of things that might go wrong. Let them fall. Not tomorrow, not when the list is finished. Now, let them fall away from the ears. Let the whole architecture of effort and management that the shoulders have been holding soften and release. You do not need to carry anything tonight. The night itself is carrying you. The chest. The place where feeling lives, where the breath moves in and out without your management, where the heart beats with its ancient, unremarkable, extraordinary persistence. Let the chest open slightly on the in-breath, not effortfully, just noticing the expansion that is already happening, giving it a little more room. And on the out-breath, let it release completely, all the way, further than you think is comfortable. Let the breath out until there is nothing left to release, and then let the next breath come in on its own, without you summoning it, without you managing it, because it will come. It always comes. The breath has been coming without your help since the moment you were born, and it will continue long past the moment you stop thinking about it. The belly, the place in you that knows things before the mind has formulated them. The place where fear arrives first. Where love sits when it has nowhere more specific to go, where the body keeps its oldest memories. Let the belly be soft. Let it receive the breath, expand with it, release with it. Let it be held by whatever surface is beneath you, the way the earth holds everything that rests on it, without effort, without preference, without any requirement that what it holds be worthy of the holding. The legs, heavy, long, going all the way down to the feet, which have carried you through this entire day and all the days before it and will carry you again tomorrow. Let them rest completely now. Let the weight of them be received by the bed, the chair, the floor. Let the weight go out of your hands and into whatever is holding you. You do not need to hold your own weight tonight. Tonight, something else is doing that. And the hands. The hands we have been talking about all night, the hands that open and close, that grip and release, that reach toward what they want and flinch away from what they fear. Let them open now in the dark against the sheet or the blanket or the air beside you. On. Let the palms face upward if it is comfortable, or simply let the fingers uncurl whatever direction they are pointing. Let the hands be open. This is the gesture. This is the whole of the teaching. If the teaching can be reduced to a gesture, the open hand, receiving what deserves to be received, releasing what needs to be released, neither grasping at what is pleasant nor pushing away what is difficult. Just the open hand, available, soft, present, resting. The Buddha's last gesture before the breath stopped beneath the flowering sal trees was not a fist, was not a wave goodbye or a blessing bestowed, or a final dramatic act of any kind. He lay on his right side, his head in the direction of the north, his face toward the west, and he released. One breath and then no breath, one moment and then another kind of moment entirely. The open hand, At the very end, against the earth that he had touched so many years before beside the Niranjana river, touching it again at the last with the same lightness. I am here, this ground is my witness, this breath, and this one, and this one, and then the one that does not come, and the stillness that is not absence but completion. You are practicing this right now, the small version of it, the nightly version, the version that is available to everyone who lies down in the dark and lets the day's grip loosen. Every breath you are breathing right now is a rehearsal for that last release. Not in a frightening way, not in a way that requires you to think about death or endings, but in the way that practice always works, building the capacity, gradually, breath by breath, for the thing that practice is for. You are building the capacity to release. You are practicing the open hand. Let the breath be slower now. There is no pace it needs to keep, no rhythm it needs to maintain. Let it find its own way, the way a river finds its own way. Through the terrain that is here, following gravity, moving without plan or agenda toward wherever water naturally goes. Your breath knows where to go. You do not need to take it there. The stories are quiet now. They have settled into the places in you that stories settle. Not in the memory exactly, not in the part of the mind that holds information, but in the deeper structure of how you understand things. The stories work there in the dark while you sleep. That is what they were always designed to do. They were told around fires and in lamplight and in the quiet of monastic halls, specifically so that the mind in its nighttime looseness could absorb them more completely than the waking mind ever could. You have been doing this all night, absorbing, softening, letting the teaching arrive in the places that are ready for it. A Pali word for what the tradition wishes you as you move toward sleep is sukha, often translated as happiness, but more precisely, the quality of experience that arises when things are well, when you are at ease, and the body is resting, and the mind is quiet, and the heart is neither clutching for what it wants nor braced against what it fears. Just here, just this, just the breath in the dark and the weight of the body being held by the earth in the night sukha. May you be at ease. The teaching has been given. The circle is closed. Akkosa has put down his anger. Kisa Gotami has opened her hands. Pasenadi is practicing the breath out. Punna is standing in a field so wide that the anger of an entire province cannot find its edges. Angulimala is sitting with his lamp. The widow's flame is burning on the road. The dead are receiving their portion. The Bodhisattva king is sitting in the dark with the peace of having given everything. Mara is walking away dejected for the last time. The Buddha is lying down between the flowering trees. And you are here, breathing slowly, almost gone into the place where the stories and the teachings and the names dissolve and only the rest remains, the open hand. The open hand. Night is yours. Sleep well. The night is almost done. Not this night necessarily. The dark outside your window may still be complete, and you may be only hours into your sleep, with the morning a long way off. That is fine. The closing of this telling is not the closing of the night. It is simply the moment when the stories step back and leave you alone with what they have placed in you. Before they go, three things, not instructions, not prescriptions. Us three images, three small gifts from the long river of this night, placed gently in your open hand. The first is the question that the Buddha asked Akkosa in the Jetavana Grove on a morning in ancient India. You can carry this question into your life, into the moments when someone offers you their anger, their contempt, their fear dressed up as aggression. And you can ask it of yourself, very quietly, without drama. If I do not receive this, to whom does it belong? You do not have to be the Buddha to decline a burning coal. You only have to pause for the length of one slow breath before you reach for it. The second is the image of Kisa Gotami's hands, empty hands. Hands that had carried something heavy for a long day, had held it, refused to put it down, walked through an entire city insisting against all evidence that what they held could somehow be restored, and had finally in the evening light let go, not because the grief was over, not because the loss was resolved, not because the arms were tired, and the truth had been seen clearly enough. and the world was going to ask her to use those hands for something else. You have hands like this. Night, whatever they have been holding tonight, whatever has been heavy in them or tight or carried longer than it needed to be carried, those hands can open. Not all the way, not all at once, but even slightly. And even the beginning of an opening is an opening. And the third is the last image of the Buddha himself lying between the sal trees as the flowers rained down on him. Not fighting what was coming, not braced against it, not trying to hold the last moment of the last breath any longer than it needed to be held, just receiving the flowers and the grief of the people around him and Ananda's love and the darkness and the silence and the next thing after silence. He had spent a lifetime practicing this. The practice was complete. You are practicing it right now in the way that sleep is a practice, the nightly rehearsal of release, of letting go of the day's grip, of trusting the dark to hold you without your management of it. Every night that you close your eyes and let yourself go under is a small version of what the Buddha did between those flowering trees. The same trust, the same open hand, the same willingness to stop holding everything together for just a few hours and let something else carry the weight. You are already practicing. The stories are going quiet now. The characters are settling into the deep places of the night. Akkosa is sitting in his courtyard in Rajagaha, turning something over in his mind. Kisa Gotami is sleeping, her hands open at her sides. And King Pasenadi is watching the moon from his palace window, trying again to practice the thing the Buddha described. The breath out, the breath out, the breath out. Punna is somewhere on the coast, preaching to people who are listening in the dark. Angulimala is sitting with a lamp, reciting the words of healing that he now means completely. The widow's lamp is burning on the road, quiet and small and steady. And somewhere in the realm of the Pitas, in whatever way receiving means for those who are gone, something that was offered is arriving. And the sal trees are still raining their flowers. They have been raining them for 2,500 years. They will continue to rain them, the tradition says, until there is no one left who needs them. And since there is always someone who needs them, they will reign forever. The gift was given. The gift is still being given. The gift will always be given to whoever is here to receive it with open hands, in the dark, in the quiet of a night like this one. Rest now. The breath is slow. The body is heavy and soft and held. You are exactly where you need to be. The teaching has arrived.